The infant Primarch who would become known as Angron crashed into the feudal world of Nuceria not as a savior or conqueror, but as prey. His gestation pod, one of 20 scattered across the galaxy by the malevolent forces of chaos, struck the mountainous regions of this technologically stagnant world with tremendous force. Unlike many of his brothers who were discovered by nobles or adopted into positions of power, Angron's fate was sealed the moment Nucerian slavers found his superhuman infant form among the wreckage. Nuceria was a world trapped in technological stagnation, where the ruling class known as the High Riders maintained their dominance through a combination of archaeotech weaponry and the systematic brutalization of the lower classes. The planet's society revolved around gladiatorial combat, where slaves fought and died for the entertainment of their masters in massive arenas that dotted the civilized regions. The High Riders, descendants of the planet's original colonists, hoarded what remained of their ancestors' advanced technology while keeping the masses in deliberate ignorance and servitude. The slavers who discovered Angron recognized his potential immediately. Even as a child, his superhuman physique and reflexes marked him as exceptional gladiatorial material. Rather than nurturing his obvious gifts or attempting to understand his origins, they saw only profit. He was dragged to the fighting pits of Descia, one of Nuceria's primary city-states, where he would spend his formative years learning that survival meant violence and that trust was a luxury few could afford. The gladiatorial schools of Nuceria were factories of death designed to break spirits and forge killers. Young Angron was thrust into this environment without ceremony or explanation. The training regimens were deliberately harsh, designed to weed out the weak and create spectacles worthy of the High Rider's attention. Slaves were pitted against wild beasts, forced to fight with inadequate weapons, and subjected to constant physical and psychological abuse. For most, this environment would have been utterly destructive, but Angron's Primarch physiology allowed him to not merely survive but excel. His early years in the pits revealed the fundamental contradiction that would define his existence. Despite his superhuman capabilities, Angron found himself drawn to the weakest and most vulnerable among his fellow slaves. Where other gladiators focused solely on their own survival, he began forming bonds with those who had no hope of lasting long in the arena. He protected the injured, shared his meager rations with the sick, and gradually became a focal point for the downtrodden slaves who saw in him something approaching hope. The High Riders of Descia took notice of their young gladiator's unusual combination of fighting prowess and protective instincts. Rather than viewing these qualities as admirable, they saw them as flaws to be corrected. Angron's capacity for empathy and his tendency to shield others threatened the fundamental dynamic of the gladiatorial system, which relied on individual desperation and the complete absence of solidarity among slaves. The solution they devised was as elegant as it was horrific. Ancient archaeotech devices known as the Butcher's Nails had been discovered in Nucerian archaeological sites, relics of the planet's technologically advanced past that the High Riders barely understood but were willing to exploit. These neural implants were designed to stimulate the brain's aggression centers while simultaneously suppressing higher cognitive functions related to empathy, complex reasoning, and emotional regulation. The implantation procedure was conducted without anesthesia or medical oversight. Crude surgical techniques were employed to insert the archaeotech devices directly into Angron's brain tissue, with the High Riders caring little for the long-term consequences as long as their investment produced results in the arena. The Butcher's Nails were never intended for human use, and their integration with Angron's Primarch physiology created an ongoing neurological catastrophe that would plague him for the remainder of his existence. The immediate effects were apparent within days of the surgery. Angron's natural empathy began warring with artificially induced aggression, creating a constant state of neurological conflict. The devices generated persistent pain that could only be alleviated through acts of violence, creating a feedback loop that reinforced aggressive behavior while punishing restraint or contemplation. His enhanced Primarch healing abilities prevented the implants from killing him outright, but they could not repair the fundamental damage being done to his neural architecture. The the psychological impact was equally devastating. Angron found himself experiencing emotions and impulses that felt foreign to his nature. Moments of genuine connection with his fellow slaves became increasingly rare, interrupted by surges of artificial rage that left him confused and disgusted with his own actions. The constant pain made concentration difficult, while the device's interference with his higher brain functions began eroding his ability to engage in complex strategic thinking or long-term planning. Despite these handicaps, or perhaps because of them, Angron's performance in the gladiatorial arena became legendary. The combination of his Primarch physiology and the Butcher's Nail's artificial stimulation created a fighting machine of unprecedented capability. He moved through opponents with a fluid brutality that mesmerized audiences while horrifying those who understood what they were witnessing. His victories were not tactical triumphs, but exercises in overwhelming violence, each one feeding the neural implants' demand for bloodshed while providing temporary relief from their constant torment. The High Rider's experiment had succeeded beyond their expectations, but they had fundamentally misunderstood their creation. Rather than producing a completely controllable killing machine, they had created something far more dangerous. Angron's protective instincts, rather than being eliminated by the Butcher's Nails, became focused and intensified. The artificial aggression was directed outward toward his oppressors, while his loyalty to his fellow slaves deepened into an unbreakable bond. As his reputation in the arena grew, so did his influence among the slave population. Other gladiators began gravitating toward him, drawn by his combination of martial prowess and unwavering loyalty to those he considered his own. These relationships became the foundation of what would eventually become known as the War Hounds, though at this stage, they were simply a collection of broken individuals who had found something approaching family in the depths of their shared suffering. The bonds Angron forged with his fellow gladiators transcended the artificial divisions the High Riders attempted to maintain among their slaves. Veterans who had survived countless arena battles found themselves protective of newer arrivals under Angron's influence. Specialists in different fighting styles began sharing knowledge rather than hoarding advantages. Most significantly, the pervasive atmosphere of despair that characterized the gladiatorial schools began giving way to something resembling hope. These relationships provided Angron with the only genuine happiness he would know during his time on Nuceria. Despite the Butcher's Nail's interference with his emotional regulation, he found that his connections with his fellow slaves could temporarily override the device's influence. Moments of camaraderie, shared meals, and quiet conversation between arena battles became precious respites from the constant neurological assault he endured. The High Riders observed these developments with growing concern. Their gladiatorial system depended on maintaining slaves in a state of individual desperation, where survival required focusing exclusively on personal advancement at the expense of others. Angron's influence was creating solidarity where none should exist, and his growing band of followers represented a potential threat to the established order. Attempts to separate Angron from his companions proved counterproductive. When isolated, his performance in the arena actually declined, as the Butcher's Nail's effects became more pronounced without the moderating influence of his social connections. When reunited with his fellow slaves, his fighting ability returned, but his influence over them grew stronger. The High Riders found themselves trapped by their own success, possessing a gladiator whose value in the arena was undeniable, but whose presence threatened the fundamental assumptions underlying their society. The situation reached a critical point when Angron's band of followers began demonstrating coordinated tactics in group combat scenarios. Rather than fighting as individuals forced to cooperate, they moved with the precision of a military unit. Their shared experiences and mutual trust allowed them to execute complex maneuvers that maximized their collective effectiveness while minimizing individual risk. These displays of martial cooperation were unprecedented in Nucerian gladiatorial combat and suggested capabilities that extended far beyond mere arena entertainment. The High Riders' response was predictably brutal. They began systematically targeting Angron's closest companions, subjecting them to increasingly dangerous arena scenarios designed to eliminate the bonds he had formed. Some were matched against impossible odds, others were subjected to rigged contests where victory was impossible. Each death was presented as the natural consequence of gladiatorial combat, but the pattern was unmistakable to those who understood the true dynamics at work. These calculated murders had the opposite effect from what the High Riders intended. Rather than breaking Angron's spirit or forcing him into isolated compliance, they crystallized his understanding of the fundamental evil represented by Nucerian society. The artificial aggression generated by the butcher's nails found a worthy target in the system that had created his suffering and was now systematically destroying everything he valued. The seeds of rebellion were planted not in grand political awakening, but in the simple recognition that the High Riders viewed him and his companions as disposable entertainment, rather than sentient beings deserving of basic dignity. This realization, filtered through the neurological chaos of the butcher's nails, transformed Angron's protective instincts into something approaching revolutionary fervor. The same loyalty that had made him shield weaker gladiators now demanded that he strike back against their oppressors. The rebellion that followed was unlike anything Nuceria had witnessed in its blood-soaked history. What began as coordinated resistance among Angron's inner circle of gladiators rapidly expanded into a full-scale slave uprising that threatened the very foundations of High Rider society. Angron's tactical brilliance, even compromised by the butcher's nails, proved devastatingly effective when applied to guerrilla warfare rather than arena combat. His followers, hardened by years of brutal training and united by genuine bonds of brotherhood, fought with a ferocity that shocked their former masters. The war raged across the mountainous regions surrounding Decia for months, with Angron's forces employing hit-and-run tactics that maximized their advantages while minimizing their exposure to the High Riders' superior technology. Captured weapons were redistributed among the rebels, while knowledge of Nucerian geography gained through gladiatorial tour allowed them to exploit terrain advantages that their opponents had never considered relevant. The High Riders found themselves facing an enemy that understood both their weaknesses and their tactical limitations in ways that conventional military opposition never could. Yet for all their initial successes, the fundamental mathematics of the conflict remained unchanged. The rebels possessed superior individual fighting ability and unshakable morale, but they lacked the industrial capacity and numerical superiority necessary for sustained warfare against an established planetary government. The High Riders controlled the major population centers, the manufacturing facilities, and most critically, the off-world communication networks that could potentially summon reinforcements from other Nucerian city-states. As the rebellion entered its final phase, Angron's forces found themselves driven back into the mountains where his pod had originally crashed decades earlier. The symbolism was lost on no one, least of all Angron himself, whose deteriorating neurological condition made such connections increasingly painful to contemplate. The butcher's nails had never ceased their relentless assault on his brain tissue, and years of constant warfare had accelerated their destructive effects. His moments of clarity became increasingly rare, while the artificial rage they generated grew more difficult to channel constructively. The final battle was set to take place on the slopes of Mount Nuceria, where the last few thousand rebels had established defensive positions among the rocky outcroppings and ancient ruins that dotted the landscape. Angron's surviving companions, perhaps 200 of his original gladiator brothers and sisters, prepared for what they all understood would be their final stand. The High Riders had assembled overwhelming force for this concluding engagement, bringing together military assets from across the planet to ensure that the slave rebellion would end definitively. It was at this moment of ultimate crisis that the Emperor of Mankind arrived on Nuceria. His approach was not announced by fanfare or diplomatic overture, but by the sudden appearance of imperial vessels in the planet's orbital space. The technology gap between the Emperor's forces and anything the Nucerians possessed was so vast as to render resistance meaningless. Where the High Riders had struggled for months to corner a few thousand escaped slaves, the Master of Mankind's forces achieved orbital supremacy and established ground presence within hours. the Emperor's personal intervention in the final battle represented one of the most controversial decisions of the Great Crusade's early phases. Rather than allowing the conflict to reach its natural conclusion, he chose to teleport Angron directly from the battlefield at the moment when his son was preparing to die alongside his gladiator family. The teleportation technology employed was precise beyond anything the Nucerians could comprehend, plucking the Primarch from the center of combat and depositing him aboard the Imperial flagship while leaving his companions to face annihilation alone. Angron's materialization in the Emperor's presence was a scene of barely contained violence. The Primarch's massive frame, scarred by decades of arena combat and recent warfare, radiated the artificial aggression generated by his neural implants. His weapons, crude by Imperial standards but deadly effective in his superhuman hands, remained clutched in grips that spoke of a lifetime spent in mortal combat. The Butcher's nails, responding to the sudden displacement and the presence of an unknown authority figure, flooded his system with neurochemical commands for immediate violence. The Emperor's first direct encounter with his 12th son revealed the full extent of the damage inflicted by Nucerian society. Where other Primarchs had been shaped by their adoptive worlds into leaders, generals, or scholars, Angron had been deliberately broken and rebuilt as a weapon of pure aggression. The neural implants were immediately apparent to the Emperor's enhanced senses, their crude archaeotech construction a mockery of the sophisticated biotechnology that had created the Primarchs themselves. More disturbing still was the evidence of their ongoing destructive effects, visible in the deterioration of brain tissue that should have been capable of self-repair. Angron's initial response to his rescue was predictably violent. The Butcher's nails interpreted the Emperor's presence as a threat requiring immediate elimination, while his conscious mind struggled to process the sudden transition from imminent death in glorious combat to apparent safety among strangers. His attacks on the Emperor and the assembled Imperial personnel were savage, but ultimately futile, his enhanced physiology no match for his Gene Father's overwhelming psychic abilities and millennia of combat experience. The restraint required to subdue Angron without causing additional injury taxed even the Emperor's considerable capabilities. The Primarch's combat instincts, honed by decades of gladiatorial training and enhanced by artificial stimulation, made him a formidable opponent even in his neurologically compromised state. His fighting style bore no resemblance to the tactical brilliance displayed by other Primarchs, instead representing pure aggression channeled through superhuman physical capabilities and an absolute disregard for personal safety. Once Angron was finally contained, the Emperor attempted to explain the circumstances of his intervention and the broader context of the Great Crusade. These efforts met with complete failure. The Primarch's ability to process complex information had been severely compromised by the Butcher's nails, while his emotional state remained locked in a cycle of rage and grief over his abandoned companions. The concept of galactic conquest, imperial unity, or even basic strategic planning seemed to hold no meaning for someone whose entire existence had been reduced to immediate survival and the protection of those he considered family. The Emperor's revelation of Angron's true nature as a genetically engineered posthuman created for the specific purpose of leading Imperial forces in galactic conquest was met with contempt rather than wonder. The Primarch's response reflected not ingratitude, but a fundamental rejection of the entire premise underlying his creation. He had not asked to be made into a weapon, had found meaning only in his relationships with fellow slaves, and now discovered that even these connections were considered expendable by the being who claimed to be his father. The immediate aftermath of Angron's integration into Imperial forces was characterized by constant conflict and barely contained violence. Standard Imperial protocol, developed for dealing with compliant or at least cooperative Primarchs, proved completely inadequate for managing someone whose neurological condition made normal social interaction nearly impossible. Angron's responses to authority, hierarchy, and even basic courtesy were filtered through the Butcher's nails' artificial aggression, turning routine interactions into potential combat situations. Imperial personnel assigned to work with the newly discovered Primarch found themselves dealing with an individual whose mood could shift from sullen resentment to homicidal rage within moments. The neural implant's demand for violence meant that Angron experienced constant physical pain that could only be alleviated through acts of aggression. This created a feedback loop where any attempt to establish normal working relationships was undermined by his neurological need to inflict harm on those around him. The Emperor's attempts to establish a traditional father-son relationship with Angron were doomed from the outset. The Primarch's capacity for trust had been systematically destroyed by his Nucerian experiences, while the Butcher's nails made sustained emotional connection nearly impossible. Where other Primarchs had eventually come to accept or even embrace their roles within the Imperial hierarchy, Angron remained fundamentally opposed to the entire concept of authority imposed from above. His rejection of Imperial culture and values was comprehensive and absolute. The pomp and ceremony that surrounded the Emperor's court struck him as grotesque displays of wealth and power built on the suffering of others. The casual acceptance of hierarchy and inherited privilege among Imperial personnel reminded him too strongly of the High Riders who had tormented him and his gladiator family. Most significantly, the Emperor's willingness to sacrifice Angron's companions for the sake of recovering a single Primarch demonstrated a utilitarian approach to human life that the former gladiator found morally repugnant. The Emperor's medical examination of the Butcher's nails represented one of his rare failures in the field of biological manipulation. The Archaeotech devices had integrated themselves so thoroughly into Angron's neural architecture that their removal would require surgical procedures that would inevitably prove fatal. The crude Nucerian technology had fused with Primarch physiology in ways that created dependencies extending far beyond their original parameters. Removing them would not restore Angron's original personality, but would instead trigger massive neurological collapse and death. This discovery forced the Emperor to confront the reality that his 12th son was irreversibly damaged in ways that no amount of Imperial technology could repair. The neural implants were not simply external modifications that could be reversed, but had become integral components of Angron's brain function. Their artificial stimulation of aggression centers had created new neural pathways while simultaneously destroying others, fundamentally altering the Primarch's cognitive architecture in ways that made restoration impossible. The Emperor's response to this limitation revealed the pragmatic ruthlessness that characterized his approach to the Great Crusade. Rather than continuing to pursue medical solutions that would inevitably prove futile, he chose to accept Angron's damaged state and attempt to channel his son's violent capabilities toward Imperial objectives. This decision represented a fundamental shift in strategy, acknowledging that the 12th Primarch could never fulfill his intended role as a tactical genius and inspiring leader, but might still serve as a weapon of pure destruction. Angron's assignment to command the 12th Legion, soon to be renamed the World Eaters, was undertaken with full knowledge of his limitations and the probable consequences for his future troops. The Emperor understood that placing a neurologically compromised Primarch in charge of an entire Space Marine Legion would inevitably result in that force adopting similarly destructive characteristics. Yet the demands of the Great Crusade required that every available resource be utilized, regardless of the long-term costs to those involved. The integration of Angron into the Imperial war machine proceeded despite his continued resistance to authority and his obvious psychological instability. Imperial administrators developed protocols for managing a Primarch whose responses to orders ranged from sullen compliance to outright violence, while military planners began adapting tactical doctrines to accommodate a commander whose strategic thinking was severely compromised by constant neurological interference. The result was a command structure built around containing and directing Angron's destructive impulses rather than genuinely utilizing his leadership potential. The 12th Legion had existed for decades before Angron's discovery, fighting under the designation war hounds across numerous compliance actions throughout the expanding Imperium. These Space Marines had earned their name through disciplined aggression and tactical precision, employing shock assault tactics that emphasized overwhelming force applied at critical points. Their gene seed, drawn from Angron's biological template, had produced warriors with enhanced physical capabilities and aggressive tendencies, but these traits remained within acceptable parameters for imperial military doctrine. The Warhounds' combat record during the early Great Crusade reflected their methodical approach to warfare. They specialized in breaking enemy defensive positions through concentrated assaults, utilizing their enhanced strength and resilience to punch through fortified lines that would have stalled conventional imperial army forces. Their tactics emphasized rapid deployment, overwhelming firepower, and relentless pressure that gave opponents no opportunity to reorganize or mount effective counterattacks. The Legion's reputation for reliability and effectiveness had made them valuable assets in campaigns where other forces might have struggled with heavily defended positions. When Angron finally assumed command of his legion, the transformation was neither immediate nor voluntary. The Primarch's initial interactions with his Gene sons were characterized by the same hostility and suspicion he displayed toward all Imperial personnel. The Warhounds' attempts to honor their newly discovered father were met with indifference at best, violent rejection at worst. Angron showed no interest in their battle honors, their tactical doctrines, or their proud traditions. To him, they represented another aspect of the imperial system that had torn him away from his true family on Nuceria. The Space Marines of the 12th Legion found themselves confronting a Primarch unlike any they had imagined. Where they had expected a tactical genius who would elevate their capabilities and guide them to greater victories, they discovered a broken warrior whose neurological damage made normal command relationships impossible. Angron's responses to their reports were unpredictable, ranging from disinterested acknowledgement to sudden explosions of violence triggered by the Butcher's nail's artificial stimulation. His strategic planning sessions devolved into incoherent rants about the futility of imperial conquest and the meaninglessness of their military objectives. The Legion's officer corps struggled to adapt to their Primarch's erratic leadership style. Traditional Space Marine hierarchy depended on clear chains of command and rational decision-making processes, neither of which functioned normally in Angron's presence. His orders were often contradictory or impossible to execute, while his tactical briefings focused more on the immediate destruction of enemy forces than on achieving broader strategic objectives. The careful coordination that had characterized Warhound's operations began breaking down as their command structure adapted to accommodate a leader whose primary concern was satisfying the neural implant's demand for violence. Captain Khorne emerged as a crucial figure during this transitional period, serving as an intermediary between Angron's chaotic leadership and the Legion's operational requirements. Unlike many of his brother officers, who viewed their Primarch's condition with horror or disgust, Khorne approached the situation with genuine curiosity and empathy. He spent considerable time observing Angron's behavior patterns, learning to recognize the signs that preceded violent episodes, and developing strategies for managing the Primarch's interactions with Legion personnel. Khorne's background as a veteran of numerous compliance actions had given him extensive experience with unconventional warfare and improvised tactics. These skills proved invaluable when dealing with a commander whose strategic thinking was compromised by constant neurological interference. He learned to interpret Angron's fragmented orders and translate them into actionable military objectives, while simultaneously protecting other Legion officers from their Primarch's unpredictable violent outbursts. His ability to function effectively despite these challenges made him increasingly indispensable to the Legion's operations. The transformation of Legion culture accelerated as more Space Marines began adopting Khorne's approach to their Primarch's condition. Rather than viewing Angron's neurological damage as a source of shame or weakness, they began interpreting it as evidence of his warrior spirit's purity. The Butcher's nails, rather than being seen as crude archaeotech modifications, were reframed as symbols of dedication to combat excellence. This ideological shift allowed the Legion to maintain unit cohesion while adapting to their Primarch's limitations. The first voluntary implantation of butcher's nails among Legion personnel occurred approximately 18 months after Angron assumed command. The procedure was undertaken by a small group of officers who had become convinced that sharing their Primarch's neurological condition would allow them to better understand and serve him. These early adopters included several company captains and veteran sergeants who had grown frustrated with their inability to effectively communicate with Angron during combat operations. The implantation process required significant modification of the original Nucerian devices to make them compatible with Space Marine physiology. Legion apothecaries worked closely with tech priests to develop surgical techniques that would minimize the risk of immediate fatality while maximizing the implant's effects on aggression and pain tolerance. The procedures were conducted in secret, without official Imperial sanction, using medical facilities aboard the Legion's flagship during extended void transits between campaign zones. The immediate effects of the neural implants on Space Marine subjects were both more pronounced and more controllable than their impact on baseline humans. The enhanced physiology and mental conditioning that characterized all Astartes provided some protection against the device's more destructive aspects, while their disciplined mindsets allowed them to channel the artificial aggression more effectively than untrained subjects. However, the fundamental neurological damage remained unavoidable, with implanted Space Marines experiencing the same constant pain and emotional instability that plagued their Primarch. The implanted officers reported an immediate improvement in their ability to understand and anticipate Angron's behavior patterns. The shared neurological experience created a form of empathetic connection that transcended normal communication barriers, allowing them to interpret their Primarch's fragmented orders and emotional states with unprecedented accuracy. This enhanced understanding translated into improved tactical coordination during combat operations, as the implanted officers could predict and respond to Angron's strategic impulses before they were explicitly communicated. Word of the voluntary implantations spread rapidly throughout the Legion, creating intense debate among the Space Marines about the wisdom and morality of such procedures. Some viewed the implanted officers as heroes who had made the ultimate sacrifice to better serve their Primarch, while others considered them traitors who had abandoned their duty to maintain the Legion's combat effectiveness. The controversy deepened as it became apparent that the implanted Marines were indeed more effective in combat operations involving Angron, leading to questions about whether such procedures should become mandatory for all Legion personnel. Angron's reaction to discovering that his Gene sons had voluntarily subjected themselves to the butcher's nails was complex and contradictory. The artificial aggression generated by his neural implants created satisfaction at seeing others share his suffering, while his deeper personality felt horror at the thought that anyone would willingly endure the constant torment he experienced. His response alternated between expressions of approval for their dedication and violent rage at their presumption in claiming to understand his condition. The success of the initial implantation procedures encouraged more Space Marines to volunteer for the surgery. Within 2 years of Angron's assumption of command, nearly 30% of the Legion's officer corps had received some form of neural modification. The procedures became increasingly sophisticated as Legion medical personnel gained experience, with newer versions of the devices producing more controlled effects while reducing the risk of immediate neurological collapse. The spread of neural implants throughout the Legion coincided with a fundamental shift in their tactical doctrine. The disciplined shock assault tactics that had characterized the Warhounds gave way to a more chaotic approach, emphasizing individual aggression and close-quarters combat. The implanted Space Marines found that their artificial stimulation was most effectively satisfied through direct physical confrontation with enemy forces, leading to tactical preferences that prioritized melee combat over ranged engagement. This doctrinal evolution was reflected in the Legion's equipment preferences and training regimens. Bolters and other ranged weapons were gradually de-emphasized in favor of chainswords, combat axes, and other close combat implements that allowed for more visceral engagement with enemy forces. The traditional Space Marine emphasis on tactical flexibility and combined arms coordination was replaced by a focus on overwhelming aggression and relentless forward momentum that gave opponents no opportunity to establish defensive positions. The Legion's performance in compliance actions began reflecting these changes within months of the first implementations. Their approach to planetary conquest became notably more brutal, with civilian casualties increasing dramatically as implanted Space Marines found it difficult to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants during the artificial rage episodes triggered by their neural devices. The careful discrimination between military targets and civilian populations that had characterized earlier Warhounds operations gave way to indiscriminate slaughter that horrified Imperial Army personnel serving alongside them. Captain Khorne's own decision to receive neural implants marked a crucial turning point in the Legion's transformation. As one of the most respected and influential officers in the 12th Legion, his voluntary submission to the procedure legitimized the practice among Space Marines who had previously been reluctant to undergo such radical modification. His post-implantation behavior demonstrated that it was possible to retain tactical effectiveness and leadership capability despite the neurological damage, providing a model for other officers to follow. The implanted Space Marines developed their own informal hierarchy based on their shared neurological condition and their ability to function effectively despite the constant pain and artificial aggression. This parallel command structure often superseded traditional Legion organization during combat operations, with implanted officers coordinating their actions through empathetic understanding rather than formal communication channels. The non-implanted Space Marines found themselves increasingly marginalized within their own Legion, viewed as incomplete warriors who lacked the dedication necessary to truly serve their Primarch. The Legion's recruitment practices began reflecting their changing priorities, with new initiates being selected based on their psychological compatibility with neural implantation rather than their potential for tactical leadership or strategic thinking. The traditional Space Marine emphasis on intellectual capability and adaptability was replaced by a focus on aggression potential and pain tolerance. These selection criteria produced recruits who were more likely to survive the implantation process, but less capable of the complex reasoning required for sophisticated military operations. The transformation of the 12th Legion's combat doctrine reached its logical conclusion with the formal adoption of the World Eater's designation. The name change reflected not just a shift in identity, but a fundamental alteration in the Legion's understanding of their role within the Great Crusade, where the Warhounds had seen themselves as disciplined soldiers serving the Emperor's vision of human unity. The World Eaters embraced their function as instruments of pure destruction whose purpose was the elimination of Imperial enemies through overwhelming violence. The adoption of gladiatorial combat traditions from Nuceria provided the final element in the Legion's cultural transformation. Training exercises began incorporating arena-style competitions where Space Marines fought each other to unconsciousness or severe injury, with the artificial aggression generated by their neural implants making such contests genuinely dangerous even among gene brothers. These practices served both to satisfy the Butcher's Nail's demand for violence and to reinforce the Legion's growing identification with their Primarch's gladiatorial background. The World Eater's reputation for effectiveness in certain types of combat operations ensured their continued deployment despite growing concerns about their methods among Imperial commanders. Their ability to break heavily fortified positions through sheer aggression and their complete disregard for casualties made them valuable assets in campaigns where other forces had failed. However, their increasing unreliability in operations requiring precision or discrimination limited their strategic utility and created tensions with other Imperial forces operating in the same theaters. The Legion's relationship with the broader Imperial military apparatus became increasingly strained as their transformation progressed. Imperial army commanders found it difficult to coordinate with World Eater's forces, whose tactical planning was compromised by their officers' neurological conditions, while other Space Marine legions began viewing the 12th Legion with suspicion and disgust. The World Eater's growing isolation within the Imperial hierarchy only reinforced their identification with their damaged Primarch and their rejection of traditional military values. The World Eater's deployment across the expanding frontiers of the Great Crusade established their reputation as the Imperium's most ruthlessly effective shock troops, though their methods increasingly horrified even veteran Imperial commanders. Their first major campaign under Angron's direct leadership occurred on the Forge world of Sarum, where Mechanicum loyalists had barricaded themselves within vast industrial complexes that conventional assault tactics had failed to breach. The World Eater's approach to the siege demonstrated the fundamental shift in their operational doctrine from the disciplined precision of their war hound's origins to something approaching controlled berserker fury. The assault on Sarum's primary manufactorum began at dawn on the campaign's 15th day, with World Eater's forces advancing across the blasted industrial wasteland that surrounded the facility's outer perimeter. The implanted Space Marines moved with a peculiar combination of tactical awareness and barely restrained violence, their neural implants generating constant neurochemical demands for close combat that made prolonged ranged engagements physically painful. Captain Khorne led the primary assault wave, his own butcher's nails creating a feedback loop of artificial aggression that spread throughout his command squad and influenced the behavior of nearby Space Marines who had not yet received implants. The Mechanicum defenders had prepared sophisticated defensive positions, incorporating automated weapon systems and hardened bunkers designed to channel attackers into predetermined killing zones. These fortifications proved devastatingly effective against conventional Imperial forces, but were ill-suited to opponents who actively sought close quarters combat regardless of casualties. The World Eaters advanced through withering fire that would have pinned down other Space Marine legions, their artificially stimulated aggression overriding normal self-preservation instincts and driving them forward into direct confrontation with the enemy. Angron's personal participation in the assault revealed the full extent of his neurological deterioration since assuming command of the Legion. The Primarch fought with a savage intensity that bore no resemblance to the tactical brilliance displayed by his brother Primarchs, wielding massive chain axes in each hand while his butcher's nails flooded his system with artificial stimulation. His combat style emphasized overwhelming physical force over finesse, crushing enemy positions through brute strength rather than exploiting tactical vulnerabilities. The constant pain generated by his neural implants was temporarily alleviated by acts of violence, creating a feedback loop that made him seek increasingly brutal confrontations. The breach of Sarum's outer defenses occurred when World Eater's assault teams, led by implanted officers who shared their Primarch's neurological condition, literally tore through reinforced barriers using their bare hands and improvised weapons. The artificial aggression generated by their neural implants made them indifferent to injuries that would have incapacitated normal Space Marines, while their enhanced healing abilities allowed them to continue fighting despite massive trauma. The sight of World Eaters continuing to advance while missing limbs or suffering grievous wounds broke the morale of Mechanicum forces who had expected to face disciplined soldiers rather than apparent madmen. The final assault on the Manufactorum's central command complex demonstrated both the effectiveness and the horrific costs of the World Eater's transformed tactical doctrine. Angron led the charge personally, his massive frame smashing through blast doors and defensive barriers, while his Gene Sons followed in his wake, their chainswords and combat axes carving through Mechanicum personnel with mechanical precision. The artificial stimulation provided by their neural implants created a state of focused rage that eliminated hesitation and doubt, but also made it impossible to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants among the facility's workforce. The aftermath of the Sarum campaign revealed the fundamental problem that would plague World Eater's operations throughout the remainder of the Great Crusade. While their tactical objectives had been achieved with unprecedented speed and efficiency, the collateral damage inflicted during their assault had rendered the Forge world's industrial capacity largely useless to the Imperium. The Mechanicum personnel who might have been integrated into Imperial service had been slaughtered alongside enemy combatants, while the manufacturing facilities themselves had been damaged beyond immediate repair by the World Eater's indiscriminate assault tactics. Imperial army commanders who had observed the World Eater's performance at Sarum began expressing private concerns about the Legion's reliability in operations requiring precision or discrimination. Their reports to higher Imperial authorities noted the Space Marines' obvious effectiveness in breaking enemy resistance, but questioned whether such methods were compatible with the Great Crusade's broader objectives of bringing human worlds into willing compliance with Imperial rule. The World Eater's approach to warfare seemed designed to create fear and submission rather than the genuine loyalty that characterized successful compliance actions. These concerns deepened during subsequent campaigns as the World Eater's reputation for brutality spread throughout the sectors where they operated. The compliance action on Genna demonstrated the escalating nature of their tactical evolution, with entire planetary defense forces surrendering immediately upon learning that Angron's Legion had been assigned to the invasion force. While such psychological warfare was undeniably effective in reducing Imperial casualties, it also created resentment and fear among newly compliant populations who viewed the World Eaters as barely controlled monsters rather than liberating heroes. The World Eaters' relationship with other Space Marine legions became increasingly strained as their transformation progressed and their methods became more extreme. The 13th Legion Ultramarines, under the command of Robute Guilliman, represented everything that Angron's forces had abandoned in their embrace of neurologically enhanced aggression. Guilliman's emphasis on tactical flexibility, combined arms coordination, and careful planning stood in stark contrast to the World Eater's preference for overwhelming frontal assault and close-quarters combat. The philosophical differences between the two Primarchs extended beyond mere tactical preferences to fundamental disagreements about the nature of warfare and the responsibilities of Space Marine forces. Guilliman's first direct encounter with Angron occurred during the joint compliance action on Armatura, where both legions had been assigned to different operational sectors of the same campaign. The Ultramarines' methodical approach to planetary conquest involved careful reconnaissance, detailed planning, and coordinated strikes against specific military targets while minimizing civilian casualties. Their operations proceeded according to predetermined timetables that allowed for contingency planning and resource allocation, with each phase building logically on previous successes to achieve comprehensive strategic objectives. The World Eater's simultaneous operations in the adjacent sector followed no such logical progression. Angron's forces landed directly on major population centers without preliminary reconnaissance, relying on their artificial aggression and enhanced physical capabilities to overwhelm local defenses through sheer violence. Their advance across the planetary surface left a trail of destruction that made subsequent occupation and integration efforts significantly more difficult, while their treatment of surrendering enemy forces violated numerous Imperial military protocols regarding prisoner handling and civilian protection. The contrast between the two legions' operational methods became apparent when Guilliman attempted to coordinate joint operations during the campaign's final phase. The Ultramarines' tactical doctrine assumed that Allied forces would respond to orders with disciplined precision and maintain communication throughout complex multi-unit maneuvers. The World Eater's actual behavior during these operations proved completely incompatible with such assumptions, as their implanted officers found it difficult to maintain focus on long-term objectives, while their neural devices generated constant demands for immediate violence. Angron's personal interactions with Guilliman during the Armatura campaign revealed the full extent of the 12th Primarch's deterioration and his growing hostility toward his brother Primarchs. Where Guilliman attempted to engage in strategic discussions about optimal deployment patterns and resource allocation, Angron responded with fragmented complaints about the meaninglessness of imperial conquest and the hypocrisy of claiming to liberate worlds through military force. The Butcher's nails made sustained conversation nearly impossible, as artificial rage episodes interrupted his attempts at coherent communication and transformed routine briefings into potential combat situations. Gilliman's reports to the Emperor following the Armatura campaign contained carefully worded concerns about the World Eater's tactical reliability and their Primarch's obvious neurological instability. These documents, preserved in Imperial archives, reveal the growing alarm among rational Primarchs about Angron's condition and its impact on his legion's effectiveness. Gilliman's recommendations included suggestions for medical intervention, tactical retraining programs, and potential restrictions on World Eater's deployment in sensitive operations where precision was required over pure destructive capability. The Emperor's response to these concerns demonstrated his pragmatic approach to managing the Great Crusade's diverse military assets. Rather than attempting to address the underlying causes of the World Eater's transformation, Imperial High Command chose to adapt deployment strategies that maximize the Legion's strengths while minimizing the impact of their limitations. This approach treated Angron's neurological damage and his Legion's brutal methods as acceptable costs for maintaining their effectiveness as shock assault troops, prioritizing immediate military utility over long-term strategic considerations. The World Eater's encounter with the 6th Legion Space Wolves during the compliance of Genna Prime created tensions that would persist throughout the remainder of the Great Crusade. Leman Russ and his Gene Sons represented a different model of controlled aggression, one that maintained the savage ferocity necessary for effective close combat while preserving the tactical discipline required for complex military operations. The Space Wolves' approach to warfare incorporated elements of their Fenrisian cultural background without allowing those influences to compromise their effectiveness as Space Marines. Russ observed the World Eater's operational methods with growing concern, recognizing in their behavior patterns the symptoms of warriors who had lost the ability to control their aggressive impulses. His own Legion's relationship with violence was carefully managed through cultural traditions and pack hierarchies that channeled aggression constructively while preventing the kind of mindless brutality that characterized World Eater's operations. The Space Wolves maintained their savage reputation without sacrificing the intellectual capabilities necessary for strategic thinking and tactical adaptation. The philosophical differences between Russ and Angron extended beyond their approaches to warfare to fundamental questions about the nature of strength and the responsibilities of military leadership. Russ viewed controlled aggression as a tool to be employed when appropriate, while Angron's neurological condition made such control increasingly impossible. The Space Wolves' Primarch recognized that his brother's transformation represented a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing violence to become an end in itself rather than a means to achieve strategic objectives. The incident that would become known as the Night of the Wolf began as a routine compliance action on a world whose designation has been lost to Imperial records. Both the World Eaters and Space Wolves had been assigned to the campaign, with their forces operating in adjacent sectors under overall Imperial Army command. The operation proceeded normally until World Eater's forces, responding to artificial stimulation from their neural implants, began executing prisoners and civilian populations in violation of explicit Imperial orders regarding the treatment of surrendering enemy forces. Russ attempted to address the situation through normal command channels, requesting that Angron control his Legion's behavior and ensure compliance with established military protocols. These efforts proved futile, as the 12th Primarch's neurological condition made him incapable of understanding or caring about the strategic implications of his force's actions. The Butcher's nails generated artificial satisfaction from reports of violence, while making it impossible for Angron to process concerns about collateral damage or long-term occupation strategies. The confrontation escalated when Space Wolves' forces discovered World Eaters systematically slaughtering civilian populations in captured settlements, their neural implants driving them to seek increasingly violent stimulation regardless of strategic necessity. Russ personally intervened to halt the massacre, leading to a direct confrontation between the two Primarchs that demonstrated the fundamental incompatibility of their approaches to warfare and military leadership. The Space Wolves' emphasis on controlled aggression clashed directly with the World Eaters' embrace of neurologically enhanced violence. The battle between the Space Wolves and World Eaters' forces lasted for 6 hours and resulted in significant casualties among both legions. The Space Wolves' tactical discipline and coordinated pack tactics proved effective against the World Eaters' individual aggression, while the 12th Legion's artificial stimulation and disregard for casualties allowed them to continue fighting despite overwhelming tactical disadvantages. The engagement demonstrated that the World Eaters' transformation had made them effective against conventional opponents, but vulnerable to forces that could match their aggression while maintaining superior tactical coordination. Angron's personal combat with Russ revealed the full extent of his deterioration as both a warrior and a leader. The 12th Primarch fought with savage intensity, but lacked the tactical awareness that characterized encounters between other Primarchs. His combat style relied entirely on overwhelming physical force enhanced by artificial stimulation, while Russ employed the sophisticated combination of strength, speed, and strategic thinking that marked all successful Primarch-level combatants. The Space Wolves Primarch recognized that his brother was no longer truly present during their confrontation, having been replaced by something approaching a sophisticated weapon directed by neurological impulses rather than conscious decision-making. The aftermath of the Night of the Wolf created lasting tensions between the two legions and established precedents that would influence Imperial policy regarding the World Eaters for the remainder of the Great Crusade. Russ's detailed reports to Imperial High Command documented the extent of Angron's neurological deterioration and the World Eaters' transformation into something that barely resembled a traditional Space Marine legion. These documents provided the foundation for subsequent decisions to limit World Eaters' deployment in operations requiring precision or coordination with other Imperial forces. Imperial commanders began developing specialized protocols for managing World Eaters' forces in joint operations, treating them more as weapons to be aimed at specific targets than as autonomous military units capable of independent strategic thinking. These adaptations acknowledged the reality of the Legion's transformation while attempting to maximize their utility within the broader framework of the Great Crusade. The World Eaters' effectiveness in certain types of combat operations ensured their continued deployment despite growing concerns about their methods and their Primarch's obvious instability. The World Eaters' reputation for excessive brutality and collateral damage spread throughout Imperial military circles, creating a complex relationship between their undeniable effectiveness and the growing reluctance of other forces to operate alongside them. Their ability to break enemy resistance through overwhelming aggression made them valuable assets in specific tactical situations, while their unpredictability and disregard for civilian casualties limited their strategic utility in operations requiring careful discrimination between combatants and non-combatants. The transformation of the World Eaters had not gone unnoticed by those who served darker masters than the Emperor of Mankind. Among the scattered legions of the Great Crusade, observers watched with growing interest as Angron's forces descended deeper into neurologically enhanced brutality. The most attentive of these watchers belonged to the 17th Legion, the Word-Bearers, whose own journey toward damnation had begun decades earlier on the ash-covered world of Monarchia. Lorgar Aurelian, the Primarch of the Word-Bearers, had spent years searching for truth beyond the Emperor's rigid secular doctrine. His legion's humiliation at Monarchia, where the Ultramarines had razed their perfect city, while the Emperor himself had forced the entire legion to kneel in the dust, had crystallized Lorgar's growing doubts about the Imperial truth. The Word-bearer's subsequent pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror had revealed cosmic realities that the Emperor had deliberately concealed from his sons, truths about the fundamental nature of the universe and the powers that shaped it. The Chaos Gods had welcomed Lorgar's seeking with open arms, revealing themselves as the true architects of human emotion and experience. Where the Emperor preached the supremacy of reason and the rejection of superstition, the ruinous powers offered acknowledgement of humanity's deeper nature. They did not demand the suppression of passion, rage, or ambition, but instead promised to elevate these qualities to their ultimate expression. For a Primarch whose entire existence had been devoted to worship and the search for transcendent meaning, the revelation of genuine divine powers was intoxicating beyond measure. Erebus, Lorgar's most trusted advisor and first chaplain of the Word-bearers, had been among the first to fully embrace the teachings revealed during their journey into the Warp. His transformation from Imperial Zealot to Servant of Chaos had been gradual but complete, involving not just intellectual acceptance of new doctrines, but fundamental changes to his spiritual and physical existence. The powers he had gained through his devotion to the Dark Gods were subtle but profound, allowing him to perceive the hidden currents of fate and influence events through carefully placed words and actions. The Word-bearer's new understanding of cosmic reality had revealed the artificial nature of the Emperor's secular philosophy and the futility of his attempts to shield humanity from its own nature. The Chaos Gods represented aspects of human consciousness that could not be denied or suppressed indefinitely, and the Emperor's Great Crusade was actually accelerating the very conflicts and emotions that fed the ruinous powers. Every act of conquest, every moment of rage or despair experienced by Imperial forces, every death inflicted in the name of human unity served to strengthen the entities the Emperor sought to weaken. Angron's condition presented a particularly intriguing opportunity for Word-bearer's manipulation. The Butcher's Nails had already begun the process that Chaos sought to complete in all humanity, breaking down the barriers between conscious control and primal emotion. The 12th Primarch's constant pain and artificial rage made him an ideal conduit for the influence of Khorne, the blood god whose domain encompassed all forms of violence and martial fury. Where other Primarchs might resist chaos corruption through rational analysis or spiritual discipline, Angron's neurological damage made such resistance nearly impossible. Erebus began his approach to the World Eaters through seemingly innocent theological discussions with the Legion's chaplains during joint operations between the Word-bearers and 12th Legion forces. These conversations appeared to focus on traditional Imperial doctrine regarding the Emperor's divinity and the spiritual obligations of Space Marines, topics that were common ground between legions regardless of their tactical differences. However, Erebus carefully introduced concepts that challenged orthodox Imperial theology while appearing to support it, planting seeds of doubt that would grow over time. The World Eaters' chaplains found themselves drawn to Erebus's sophisticated theological arguments and his apparent deep understanding of spiritual matters that their own training had barely addressed. The 12th Legion's focus on combat effectiveness had left little time for complex philosophical education, and many of their spiritual leaders felt inadequately prepared to address the existential questions that arose from their increasingly brutal operational methods. Erebus offered answers that seemed to justify their transformation while providing a framework for understanding their Primarch's condition. The first chaplain's arguments centered on the concept that the Emperor's rejection of religious worship was itself a form of spiritual blindness that prevented humanity from accessing its full potential. He suggested that the ancient powers that had shaped human consciousness throughout history were not the primitive superstitions that Imperial doctrine claimed, but genuine cosmic forces whose influence could be harnessed for humanity's benefit. The Emperor's attempt to deny these realities was not protecting humanity, but instead weakening it by cutting off access to sources of strength that could enhance Imperial military effectiveness. These theological discussions gradually shifted toward more specific considerations of the World Eaters' unique circumstances and their Primarch's neurological condition. Erebus suggested that Angron's suffering was not meaningless torment, but a form of spiritual trial that could lead to transcendent understanding if properly interpreted. The butcher's nails, rather than being crude archaeotech modifications, might represent a primitive attempt to access the same cosmic forces that had shaped human warfare throughout history. The constant pain and artificial rage they generated could be viewed as forms of spiritual discipline that prepared the recipient for higher levels of consciousness. The word bearer's influence on World Eater's doctrine became more pronounced during extended joint campaigns, where both legions operated in close proximity for months at a time. Erebus and his fellow chaplains began conducting informal training sessions for World Eater's personnel, ostensibly focused on improving their understanding of imperial theology and military ethics. These sessions actually served to introduce concepts drawn from chaos doctrine while maintaining the appearance of orthodox imperial teaching. The theological framework that Erebus presented to the World Eaters recontextualized their transformation from a source of shame into a mark of spiritual evolution. He argued that their willingness to undergo neural implantation demonstrated a level of dedication to military excellence that transcended normal human limitations. The artificial aggression generated by the butcher's nails was not a corruption of their natural state, but an enhancement that allowed them to access primal aspects of human nature that civilized society had suppressed. Their increasing brutality in combat operations reflected not moral degradation, but spiritual purification through the elimination of weakness and hesitation. These arguments found receptive audiences among World Eaters officers who had struggled to reconcile their legion's transformation with traditional imperial values. The constant pain generated by their neural implants made philosophical contemplation difficult, but Erebus's teachings offered simple explanations that required little complex reasoning to understand. The concept that their suffering served a higher purpose provided psychological relief from the guilt and confusion that many implanted Space Marines experienced regarding their changed nature. Captain Khorne proved particularly susceptible to Word-Bearer's influence, though his adoption of their theological perspectives was gradual and initially unconscious. His role as intermediary between Angron and the rest of the Legion had exposed him to the full extent of his Primarch's neurological damage and the futility of attempting to restore normal command relationships. Erebus's suggestion that Angron's condition represented a form of spiritual enlightenment rather than medical dysfunction offered an alternative interpretation that made Khorne's loyalty feel meaningful rather than tragic. The Word-Bearer's theological influence on the World Eaters accelerated as reports of their joint operations spread throughout both legions. Space Marines who had not directly participated in these campaigns began requesting transfers to units where they could work more closely with Lorger's forces, drawn by accounts of the spiritual insights and enhanced combat effectiveness that such cooperation supposedly provided. The Word-Bearers encouraged these requests while carefully managing the pace of doctrinal change to avoid triggering Imperial oversight or resistance from World Eaters personnel who remained committed to orthodox Imperial beliefs. Erebus's most significant breakthrough came during a private theological discussion with Angron himself, arranged during a brief respite between campaigns when both Primarchs were aboard the same vessel for strategic planning. The 12th Primarch's neurological condition made sustained conversation nearly impossible, but Erebus had learned to communicate in brief, emotionally charged statements that could penetrate the artificial rage generated by the butcher's nails. His approach focused on validating Angron's suffering while suggesting that it served purposes beyond mere torment. The first chaplain's arguments to Angron centered on the concept that his neural implants had inadvertently connected him to cosmic forces that transcended normal human understanding. The constant pain and artificial aggression were not symptoms of damage, but forms of spiritual communication from entities that existed beyond the material universe. These powers, which Erebus carefully avoided identifying by name, offered the promise of enhanced strength and the elimination of weakness through the embrace of fundamental aspects of existence that the Emperor sought to suppress. Angron's response to these theological arguments was filtered through the neurological chaos of his condition, but certain concepts resonated with his damaged psyche in ways that rational discourse could not achieve. The suggestion that his suffering served a meaningful purpose provided temporary relief from the despair that had characterized his existence since his removal from Nuceria. The promise of enhanced strength and the elimination of enemies appealed to the artificial aggression generated by his neural implants, while the concept of cosmic forces that existed beyond imperial authority offered hope for escape from the system that had destroyed his gladiator family. The Word-Bearer's influence on World Eater's culture became increasingly apparent in the rituals and ceremonies that began appearing within the 12th Legion during the months following these theological discussions. Training exercises started incorporating elements that bore superficial resemblance to traditional imperial practices, but contained subtle references to concepts drawn from chaos doctrine. Combat prayers began emphasizing themes of strength through suffering and the purification achieved through violence, while victory celebrations included symbolic elements that honored the spiritual significance of bloodshed. These ritual modifications were introduced gradually and presented as innovations designed to improve Legion morale and combat effectiveness rather than departures from imperial orthodoxy. The World Eater's focus on practical military concerns made them less likely to scrutinize the theological implications of these changes, while their increasing isolation from other imperial forces reduced the likelihood of external observation or criticism. The artificial aggression generated by their neural implants made them receptive to practices that channeled their violent impulses in structured ways. The discovery of chaos as a potential solution to the pain generated by the butcher's nails represented Erebus's most sophisticated manipulation of World Eater's psychology. He presented this revelation not as an abandonment of imperial doctrine, but as the recovery of ancient human knowledge that the Emperor had suppressed for political rather than spiritual reasons. The cosmic forces that could alleviate the constant torment experienced by implanted space marines were portrayed as natural aspects of reality that had been deliberately hidden to maintain imperial control over space marine legions. This theological framework provided a compelling explanation for the World Eater's transformation while offering hope for relief from their neurological suffering. The promise that proper spiritual discipline could reduce or eliminate the pain generated by their neural implants was particularly attractive to space marines who had undergone implantation primarily to better serve their Primarch. The concept that their artificial aggression could be channeled toward cosmic purposes rather than mere military objectives gave meaning to their changed nature that imperial doctrine could not provide. The early signs of genuine demonic influence within the World Eater's Legion began manifesting during combat operations conducted in the months following their exposure to Word-Bearer's theological instruction. Implanted space marines reported experiences during battle that transcended normal sensory perception, including visions of cosmic entities that encouraged their violent actions and promised greater strength through increased brutality. These experiences were initially dismissed as hallucinations caused by neurological damage, but their consistency across multiple individuals suggested influences beyond mere medical dysfunction. The visions experienced by World Eater's personnel during combat typically involved massive humanoid figures wreathed in blood and flame, entities that radiated approval for acts of violence while expressing contempt for weakness or mercy. These apparitions appeared most frequently during moments of intense combat when the artificial aggression generated by neural implants reached peak intensity, suggesting a connection between the butcher's nails' effects and whatever forces were manifesting these images. The entities communicated not through words, but through direct emotional transmission that bypassed normal cognitive processes. Captain Khorne's reports of these experiences to his Primarch marked a crucial turning point in the World Eater's relationship with chaos influence. Rather than expressing concern about potential psychological instability among his Gene sons, Angron interpreted these visions as validation of his own experiences with the neural implants. The 12th Primarch had long reported similar perceptions during combat, though his damaged neurological condition had made it difficult for others to understand or interpret his descriptions. The discovery that other implanted space marines were experiencing comparable phenomena suggested that these were not mere hallucinations, but genuine spiritual communications. The Word-Bearer's response to reports of demonic manifestations among World Eater's personnel was carefully calculated to encourage further development, while maintaining plausible deniability regarding their role in these events. Erebus and his fellow chaplains expressed scholarly interest in these phenomena, while suggesting that they represented evidence of the World Eater's spiritual evolution beyond normal imperial limitations. The visions were interpreted as signs of cosmic approval for the Legion's dedication to martial excellence and their willingness to embrace suffering in service of higher purposes. The theological framework that the Word-Bearers provided for understanding these demonic influences emphasized their beneficial nature and their compatibility with imperial military objectives. The entities that appeared to World Eater's personnel were described as aspects of cosmic forces that had shaped human warfare throughout history, spiritual powers that could enhance combat effectiveness when properly acknowledged and honored. Their apparent approval of violence and their contempt for weakness were presented as evidence of their alignment with imperial military values rather than corruption of those principles. This interpretation of demonic influence as spiritual enhancement rather than chaos corruption proved compelling to World Eater's personnel who were struggling to understand their changing nature and their increasingly extreme combat behavior. The constant pain generated by their neural implants made complex theological analysis difficult, while the artificial aggression they experienced created psychological receptivity to explanations that validated their violent impulses. The promise that their suffering served cosmic purposes provided meaning that imperial doctrine could not offer. The World Eater's combat performance during operations conducted under Word-Bearer's theological influence demonstrated measurable improvements in certain metrics, while revealing disturbing changes in others. Their effectiveness in breaking enemy resistance through overwhelming assault increased significantly, with implanted Space Marines displaying enhanced strength and endurance that exceeded normal Astartes' capabilities. However, their ability to distinguish between military objectives and civilian targets continued to deteriorate, while their treatment of prisoners and surrendering enemies became increasingly brutal even by their previous standards. These performance changes were accompanied by physical modifications that became apparent to observant Imperial personnel during the months following the World Eater's exposure to Word-Bearer's influence. Implanted Space Marines began displaying subtle alterations in appearance that suggested influences beyond mere neural stimulation, including changes in eye coloration, dental structure, and muscle development that could not be explained by normal Astartes physiology. These modifications were gradual and initially attributed to side effects of the neural implantation process, but their consistency across multiple individuals suggested systematic rather than random causes. The World Eater's increasing bloodthirsty nature extended beyond their previous extremes as demonic influence began affecting their behavior outside of combat situations. Training exercises became genuinely dangerous as implanted Space Marines found it difficult to moderate their aggression even during practice sessions with Gene brothers. Disciplinary procedures required increasing levels of violence to achieve compliance, while routine interactions between Legion personnel became tense and potentially explosive as artificial stimulation made normal social behavior nearly impossible. The Legion's relationship with Imperial Army forces serving alongside them deteriorated rapidly as their transformation accelerated under Word-Bearer's influence. Imperial Guard commanders reported increasing difficulty in coordinating with World Eater's units, whose behavior had become unpredictable and dangerous even to Allied personnel. The Space Marines' enhanced aggression and their growing indifference to collateral damage made them unreliable partners in operations requiring precision or discrimination between combatants and non-combatants. The corruption that had been steadily seeping into the World Eaters through Word-Bearer's influence found its ultimate expression when Horus Lupercal, the most favored of all Primarchs, fell to chaos on the moon of Davin. The Warmaster's transformation sent shockwaves throughout the galaxy, but for Angron and his legion, it represented not betrayal but liberation from the hypocrisy they had endured since their integration into Imperial forces. The neural implants that had tormented the 12th Primarch for decades suddenly aligned with cosmic forces that promised unlimited violence and the complete abandonment of Imperial restraints. Horus's initial overtures to his brother Primarchs were carefully calculated to exploit their individual grievances against the Emperor and the Imperial system. For Angron, the Warmaster's arguments required little sophistication, as the 12th Primarch's neurological condition made complex political reasoning nearly impossible. Instead, Horus appealed directly to the artificial rage generated by the Butcher's nails, presenting the rebellion as an opportunity to inflict unlimited violence upon the system that had destroyed Angron's gladiator family and condemned him to a lifetime of neurological torment. The Warmasters promised that chaos would provide relief from the constant pain generated by the neural implants proved particularly compelling to Angron's damaged psyche. The Emperor had demonstrated his inability or unwillingness to remove the Butcher's nails, leaving his 12th son to suffer indefinitely for the sake of maintaining the Legion's combat effectiveness. Horus offered an alternative that acknowledged Angron's pain while promising to transform it into a source of strength rather than mere torment. The cosmic forces that the Warmaster served could enhance the artificial aggression generated by the neural implants, while eliminating the psychological conflict that had plagued Angron since his discovery. Angron's decision to join the rebellion was influenced not only by his personal grievances, but by his growing understanding of the Emperor's true nature, as revealed through Word-Bearer's theological instruction. The Master of Mankind's claim to oppose superstition and promote reason had been exposed as hypocrisy designed to maintain his own power, while denying humanity access to cosmic forces that could enhance their capabilities. The Emperor's refusal to acknowledge the Chaos Gods as legitimate entities demonstrated his willingness to suppress truth in service of his political objectives, making him no different from the High Riders who had tormented Angron on Nuceria. The World Eaters' embrace of the heresy was facilitated by their existing isolation from other Imperial forces and their deteriorating relationship with orthodox Imperial doctrine. Their transformation under Word-Bearer's influence had already begun the process of separating them from traditional Space Marine values, while their increasing brutality had made cooperation with loyal Imperial forces increasingly difficult. The rebellion offered them an opportunity to fully embrace their violent nature without the restraints imposed by Imperial military protocols or concerns about civilian casualties. Captain Khorne emerged as a crucial figure in facilitating the Legion's transition to Chaos Allegiance, using his position as intermediary between Angron and the rank and file Space Marines to ensure smooth implementation of the Warmaster's orders. His own neural implants had made him particularly receptive to the demonic influences that accompanied the Legion's corruption, while his tactical expertise allowed him to coordinate the complex logistics required for rebellion against the Imperium. His enthusiasm for the heresy was genuine rather than calculated, reflecting the relief that many World Eaters felt at finally being permitted to fully express their artificially enhanced aggression. The initial stages of the heresy required careful coordination between the rebel legions to ensure that their betrayal would achieve maximum strategic impact while minimizing the risk of premature detection by loyal Imperial forces. The World Eaters' role in these early operations was necessarily limited by their tactical limitations and their Primarch's neurological condition, but their reputation for overwhelming violence made them valuable assets in situations where shock value and psychological impact were more important than precision or subtlety. The Isstvan III atrocity represented the World Eaters' first major contribution to the heresy and demonstrated their complete abandonment of imperial values regarding the treatment of fellow space marines. The operation was designed to eliminate loyalist elements within the rebel legions, while testing the traitors' commitment to their new allegiances through acts that would make reconciliation with the Emperor impossible. For the World Eaters, the systematic slaughter of their own gene brothers who had refused to embrace chaos corruption was not a moral crisis, but an opportunity to satisfy the demands of their neural implants through sanctioned violence. The virus bombing of Isstvan III preceded the ground assault by several hours, saturating the planet's atmosphere with life-eater toxins that killed most of the loyalist forces before they could mount effective resistance. The World Eaters who participated in the orbital bombardment experienced the artificial satisfaction generated by their neural implants despite their physical distance from the violence, as the Butcher's nails responded to the knowledge of mass death rather than requiring direct participation in combat. This phenomenon suggested that their corruption had progressed beyond mere neurological modification to encompass genuine demonic influence. When the World Eaters made planetfall on Isstvan III, they encountered scattered groups of loyalist survivors who had managed to find shelter from the virus weapons in sealed bunkers and underground facilities. These space marines, drawn from various legions, including some World Eaters who had rejected the heresy, represented everything that the traitors had abandoned in their embrace of chaos. The contrast between the disciplined resistance offered by the Loyalists and the frenzied assault launched by the World Eaters illustrated the fundamental transformation that had occurred within the 12th Legion. Angron's personal participation in the ground assault on Isstvan III revealed the full extent of his corruption and the enhancement of his already formidable combat capabilities through demonic influence. The Primarch moved through Loyalist positions with inhuman speed and strength, his twin chain axes carving through power armor and enhanced physiology with equal ease. The artificial aggression generated by his neural implants was amplified by cosmic forces that fed on the violence he inflicted, creating a feedback loop that made him increasingly dangerous as the battle progressed. The Loyalist World Eaters who faced their corrupted Primarch on Isstvan III found themselves confronting not just a superior opponent, but something that had transcended normal physical limitations through supernatural enhancement. Angron's combat style retained the brutal directness that had characterized his fighting since his gladiatorial days, but his movements now carried an otherworldly quality that suggested influences beyond mere neurological stimulation. His presence on the battlefield created an aura of violence that affected both friend and foe, inspiring his corrupted gene sons to greater brutality while filling Loyalist forces with supernatural dread. The systematic purging of Loyalist elements within the World Eaters during the Isstvan III campaign was conducted with the same methodical efficiency that had once characterized their compliance actions during the Great Crusade. However, the criteria for determining loyalty had been fundamentally altered by their embrace of chaos doctrine. Space Marines who expressed concern about civilian casualties or questioned the necessity of extreme violence were identified as potential loyalists, regardless of their stated allegiance to the War Master. The neural implants that many World Eaters had received made such moral considerations increasingly rare, but those who retained elements of their original personalities were systematically eliminated. The few World Eaters who survived the Loyalist purges did so through a combination of tactical skill and willingness to fully embrace the Legion's transformation. These Space Marines had either received neural implants that eliminated their capacity for moral hesitation, or had consciously chosen to suppress such concerns in favor of survival. Their continued existence within the Legion served as examples to other Imperial forces of the complete abandonment of traditional Space Marine values that chaos corruption could produce. The aftermath of Isstvan III saw the World Eaters emerge as one of the most thoroughly corrupted of the traitor legions, their transformation from disciplined Space Marines to chaos-enhanced berserkers essentially complete. The systematic elimination of Loyalist elements had removed the last internal constraints on their violent behavior, while their exposure to genuine demonic influence had begun producing physical and psychological changes that went far beyond the effects of their neural implants. The legion that had once been known as the Warhounds had become something entirely different, united only by their shared addiction to violence and their loyalty to their damaged Primarch. The drop site massacre at Isstvan 5 provided the World Eaters with their most significant opportunity to demonstrate their enhanced capabilities against Loyalist Space Marine forces. The operation was designed as a trap for Loyalist legions responding to reports of the rebellion, with the initial wave of loyal forces actually consisting of traitors who would turn on their allies once battle was joined. The World Eaters were assigned to the second wave of the assault, positioned to exploit the confusion created by the betrayal while maximizing the psychological impact of their enhanced aggression. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard, who comprised the initial Loyalist assault force, were unprepared for the level of coordination between the traitor legions and the supernatural enhancement that Chaos Corruption had provided to their enemies. The World Eaters' assault on the Loyalist drop zones was characterized by a savagery that exceeded even their previous extremes, with implanted Space Marines displaying strength and endurance that clearly transcended normal Astartes' capabilities. The sight of their fellow Space Marines fighting with inhuman ferocity, while showing no regard for their own survival, broke the morale of Loyalist forces who had expected to face disciplined opponents. Angron's rampage through the Loyalist lines during the drop site massacre became legendary among both traitor and Loyalist forces for its sheer destructive power and complete disregard for tactical objectives beyond immediate violence. The Primarch carved a path of destruction through Iron Hands formations that had taken defensive positions among the rocky outcroppings of the Urgal Depression, his twin chain axes reducing power-armored Space Marines to component parts with mechanical precision. The artificial aggression generated by his neural implants was enhanced by demonic influence that made him appear to grow larger and more terrible as the slaughter continued. The World Eaters' coordination with other traitor legions during the massacre demonstrated that their transformation had not completely eliminated their tactical capabilities, though these now served Chaos objectives rather than Imperial military doctrine. Their assault was timed to maximize the psychological impact on Loyalist forces, while ensuring that escape routes were cut off before the trap became apparent. The Legion's reputation for overwhelming violence served as a force multiplier that caused Loyalist units to break and run rather than attempt coordinated resistance. The slaughter of the Salamanders and Raven Guard forces trapped in the killing ground of Isstvan 5 provided the World Eaters with an opportunity to fully indulge their artificially enhanced bloodlust without restraint or criticism. The neural implants that had tormented them for years finally found complete satisfaction in sanctioned violence against enemies who deserved no mercy. The artificial pain that had plagued implanted Space Marines was temporarily alleviated by acts of extreme brutality, creating positive reinforcement for behavior that would have horrified their former selves. Captain Khorne's performance during the drop site massacre established his reputation as one of the most effective champions of Khorne among the World Eaters, though his dedication to the Blood God remained unconscious at this stage of the heresy. His tactical coordination of World Eaters' assault units demonstrated that neural implantation need not completely eliminate strategic thinking if the artificial aggression was properly channeled toward military objectives. His ability to maintain unit cohesion while maximizing the violent potential of his Gene brothers made him invaluable to Angron's increasingly chaotic command structure. The complete abandonment of Imperial doctrine that characterized World Eaters' operations during Isstvan 5 extended beyond mere tactical considerations to encompass fundamental changes in their understanding of warfare's purpose and meaning. Where Imperial military doctrine emphasized the achievement of strategic objectives through the controlled application of force, the World Eaters had embraced violence as an end in itself, worthy of pursuit regardless of broader military considerations. Their neural implants and demonic corruption had aligned their psychological needs with cosmic forces that fed on bloodshed and conflict. The World Eater's treatment of wounded Loyalist forces during and after the drop site massacre violated every principle of honorable warfare that had once characterized Space Marine combat. Rather than offering quick deaths to defeated enemies or attempting to extract useful intelligence from prisoners, they prolonged the suffering of captured Loyalists to maximize the satisfaction provided by their neural implants. These acts of deliberate cruelty served no military purpose beyond feeding the artificial aggression that had become central to their existence. The physical changes that became apparent among World Eater's personnel following their participation in the Isstvan campaigns suggested that their corruption had progressed beyond mere psychological transformation to encompass genuine mutation. Implanted Space Marines began displaying alterations in bone structure, muscle development, and sensory capabilities that could not be explained by normal Astartes physiology or the effects of neural implantation. These modifications appeared to enhance their combat effectiveness while making them increasingly inhuman in appearance and behavior. The World Eater's embrace of chaos-fueled warfare represented the logical conclusion of their transformation from disciplined Space Marines to neurologically enhanced berserkers. The artificial aggression generated by their neural implants had found perfect alignment with cosmic forces that rewarded violence and bloodshed while punishing restraint or mercy. Their participation in the heresy was not a betrayal of their nature, but the fulfillment of tendencies that had been developing since Angron's assumption of command and his legion's adoption of Nucerian gladiatorial traditions. The success of the Isstvan campaigns established the World Eaters as valuable assets within the broader framework of Horus's rebellion, despite their tactical limitations and their Primarch's obvious neurological instability. Their ability to break Loyalist morale through overwhelming violence and their complete disregard for casualties made them effective shock troops in situations where conventional tactics had failed. However, their increasing unpredictability and their growing addiction to violence for its own sake created challenges for traitor commanders attempting to coordinate complex military operations. The World Eaters' complete transformation into servants of chaos found its ultimate expression in their alliance with Lorgar and the Word-Bearers during what would become known as the Shadow Crusade. This joint campaign represented more than mere military cooperation between traitor legions. It was a calculated assault on the spiritual foundations of imperial rule, designed to spread chaos worship throughout the Ultramar sector, while simultaneously preparing Angron for his apotheosis to demonhood. The operation combined the Word-Bearers' theological expertise with the World Eater's capacity for overwhelming violence, creating a synergy that would devastate Loyalist forces across dozens of worlds. Lorgar's strategic vision for the Shadow Crusade extended far beyond conventional military objectives to encompass the systematic corruption of imperial populations through exposure to chaos doctrine and demonic influence. The Word-Bearers had spent decades perfecting techniques for converting imperial citizens to chaos worship, developing sophisticated methods that exploited existing religious tendencies while gradually introducing concepts drawn from the ruinous powers. Their approach emphasized the voluntary acceptance of chaos rather than mere conquest, creating genuinely committed populations that would continue spreading corruption long after the traitor legions had moved on to other targets. The World Eaters' role in this theological campaign was necessarily different from their Word-Bearer allies, as their neurological condition made them unsuitable for the subtle manipulation required for mass conversion. Instead, Angron's legion served as the instrument of terror that broke Loyalist resistance and created the conditions of despair and suffering that made populations receptive to chaos promises of strength and purpose. Their reputation for extreme brutality preceded them across the Ultramar sector, causing entire planetary governments to surrender without resistance, rather than face the systematic slaughter that World Eaters' occupation inevitably brought. The campaign's opening phase targeted outlying worlds in the Ultramar sector, where Imperial presence was minimal and local defense forces were unprepared for the coordinated assault launched by 2 full Space Marine legions. The Word-Bearers established orbital supremacy through conventional fleet actions, while World Eaters drop pods rain down on major population centers, their occupants emerging in states of artificially enhanced rage that made resistance futile. The contrast between the Word-Bearers' disciplined precision and the World Eaters' frenzied assault created psychological effects that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Angron's personal participation in these early engagements revealed the accelerating pace of his corruption and the growing influence of demonic forces on his already damaged psyche. The Primarch's combat performance had transcended even his previous extremes, with his twin chain axes moving through loyalist formations with supernatural speed and precision. His presence on the battlefield created an aura of violence that affected both enemy and allied forces, inspiring his Gene Sons to greater brutality while filling Imperial defenders with supernatural dread that broke their morale before physical contact was even established. The systematic destruction of Imperial infrastructure during World Eaters' assaults served multiple purposes within the broader framework of the Shadow Crusade. The immediate objective was to eliminate Loyalist military capabilities and prevent coordinated resistance to the traitor advance, but the collateral damage inflicted during these operations also created the suffering and despair that chaos required for effective corruption. The sight of burning cities and slaughtered populations demonstrated the futility of Imperial protection while suggesting that only the ruinous powers offered genuine strength in a hostile universe. Captain Khorne's evolution during the Shadow Crusade demonstrated the complete integration of chaos influence with the artificial aggression generated by neural implantation. His tactical coordination of World Eaters' assault forces had become increasingly sophisticated despite his obvious neurological damage, suggesting that demonic enhancement was compensating for the cognitive impairment caused by the Butcher's nails. His ability to maintain unit cohesion while maximizing the violent potential of his Gene brothers made him invaluable to operations that required both overwhelming force and basic tactical coordination. The Word-Bearer's theological instruction of World Eaters personnel continued throughout the campaign, with Erebus and his fellow chaplains conducting regular indoctrination sessions that gradually introduced more explicit chaos doctrine. These educational programs no longer maintained the pretense of orthodox imperial teaching, but instead openly acknowledged the ruinous powers as legitimate cosmic entities worthy of worship and service. The World Eaters' neurological condition made them receptive to simple theological concepts that emphasized strength through violence, while requiring minimal complex reasoning to understand. The campaign's first major target was the industrial world of Armatura, whose manufacturing capabilities and strategic location made it a crucial component of Ultramar's defensive infrastructure. The planet's extensive orbital defenses and well-trained PDF forces represented a significant challenge that would have required careful planning and coordinated assault tactics from conventional Imperial forces. However, the combined capabilities of the Word-Bearers and World Eaters created tactical options that were unavailable to Loyalist commanders operating within the constraints of Imperial military doctrine. The assault on Armatura began with Word-Bearers' fleet elements establishing orbital supremacy through a combination of superior numbers and demonic enhancement that gave their vessels capabilities beyond normal Imperial Navy specifications. The planet's defense platforms and orbital installations were systematically destroyed through coordinated bombardment that eliminated the Loyalists' ability to contest the traitor advance. The speed and efficiency of this preliminary phase demonstrated the enhanced coordination that Chaos Corruption had provided to the rebel forces. World Eaters dropped pod assaults on Armatura's primary, Hive cities created immediate chaos that prevented effective coordination of planetary defense efforts. The Space Marines who emerged from these orbital insertions were in states of artificially enhanced rage that made them indifferent to casualties while maximizing their combat effectiveness against conventional opposition. Their assault tactics emphasized overwhelming violence over tactical finesse, breaking through defensive positions through sheer aggression rather than exploiting tactical vulnerabilities. The systematic slaughter of Armatura's civilian population during the World Eater's urban assault operations served both immediate tactical purposes and broader strategic objectives within the Shadow Crusade's theological framework. The immediate goal was to eliminate potential resistance and prevent the organization of guerrilla warfare that could complicate occupation efforts. However, the mass casualties also created the suffering and despair that made surviving populations receptive to chaos promises of strength and protection from imperial weakness. Angron's rampage through Armatura's capital, Hive became legendary among both traitor and loyalist forces for its sheer destructive power and complete disregard for any military objective beyond immediate violence. The Primarch carved a path of destruction through defensive positions that had been designed to channel attackers into predetermined killing zones, his supernatural strength and speed making conventional fortifications irrelevant. His twin chain axes reduced power-armored PDF troopers and civilian populations to component parts with equal mechanical precision, while his presence inspired his Gene sons to similar acts of extreme brutality. The Word-Bearers' simultaneous operations in Armatura's outlying settlements demonstrated their sophisticated approach to population conversion and the systematic destruction of imperial religious infrastructure. Rather than simply eliminating loyalist forces, Lorgar's Gene sons conducted carefully planned operations that preserved potential converts while eliminating those who showed strong resistance to chaos influence. Their approach emphasized the voluntary acceptance of new theological concepts rather than mere conquest, creating genuinely committed populations that would continue spreading corruption after the traitor legions departed. The establishment of chaos shrines and ritual sites throughout Armatura's conquered territories marked a crucial phase in the planet's transformation from imperial world to chaos stronghold. These installations served both as focal points for demonic manifestation and as centers for the theological instruction of converted populations. The Word-Bearers' expertise in chaos ritual and their understanding of the specific requirements for summoning demonic entities made them invaluable in creating the infrastructure necessary for sustained chaos presence on conquered worlds. The World Eaters' participation in these ritual activities revealed the extent of their corruption and their growing alignment with the cosmic forces that the Word-Bearers served. Implanted Space Marines, who had previously shown no interest in theological matters, began displaying genuine enthusiasm for ceremonies that honored violence and bloodshed. Their neural implants responded to the psychic resonance created by mass ritual activity, providing temporary relief from constant pain while reinforcing their dedication to chaos objectives. The systematic targeting of Ultramarines' forces throughout the Armatura campaign demonstrated the traitors' understanding of their enemy's tactical doctrine and their ability to exploit the weaknesses inherent in loyalist military thinking. The 13th Legion's emphasis on careful planning and coordinated operations made them vulnerable to the unpredictable violence that characterized World Eaters' assault tactics, while their concern for civilian casualties limited their tactical options when facing enemies who showed no such restraint. The few Ultramarines forces that managed to establish defensive positions on Armatura found themselves confronting enemies whose capabilities transcended normal Space Marine limitations through supernatural enhancement. World Eaters' assault teams displayed strength and endurance that clearly exceeded Astartes' norms, while their complete indifference to casualties made conventional defensive tactics ineffective. The sight of their fellow Space Marines fighting with inhuman ferocity, while showing no regard for their own survival-created psychological effects that extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. The ritual preparations that accompanied the Shadow Crusade's military operations served multiple purposes within the broader framework of Angron's planned apotheosis to demonhood. The mass casualties inflicted during World Eaters' assault operations provided the blood sacrifice that Khorne required for major demonic manifestations, while the systematic destruction of Imperial infrastructure created the chaos and despair that fed all the ruinous powers. Each conquered world became a component in an increasingly elaborate ritual designed to transform the 12th Primarch from a neurologically damaged posthuman into a true demon prince. The collection of skulls from fallen enemies became an obsession among World Eater's personnel as the campaign progressed, with individual space marines competing to gather the most impressive trophies from their victims. This practice served both to satisfy the artificial aggression generated by their neural implants and to provide the specific ritual components that chaos ceremonies required. The skulls of space marines, Imperial Guard officers, and planetary governors were particularly prized for their symbolic value and their psychic resonance with the violence that had claimed their original owners. Angron's own collection of skulls grew to massive proportions as the Shadow Crusade continued, with the Primarch's personal trophies including the heads of loyalist commanders, civilian leaders, and anyone else who had the misfortune to face him in combat. The artificial aggression generated by his neural implants found perfect satisfaction in these ritual activities, while the demonic influence that increasingly dominated his consciousness interpreted each new skull as evidence of his worthiness for elevation to true demonhood. The Word-Bearer's coordination of these ritual activities demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of chaos theology and their ability to channel the violent energies generated by World Eater's operations towards specific supernatural objectives. Erebus and his fellow Dark Apostles conducted elaborate ceremonies that incorporated the blood and skulls gathered during military operations, creating focal points for demonic manifestation that gradually transformed conquered worlds into extensions of the warp itself. The increasing frequency of demonic manifestations during Shadow Crusade operations reflected the growing alignment between the traitors' military activities and the cosmic forces they served. Lesser demons began appearing on battlefields where World Eater's forces were engaged, drawn by the violence and bloodshed that their presence generated. These supernatural entities served as force multipliers that enhanced the traitors' combat effectiveness while providing tangible evidence of the ruinous power's approval for their actions. The physical transformation of World Eater's personnel accelerated dramatically during the Shadow Crusade as their exposure to concentrated chaos influence reached unprecedented levels. Implanted Space Marines began displaying mutations that went far beyond the effects of neural modification, including alterations in bone structure, muscle development, and sensory capabilities that clearly indicated demonic enhancement. These changes improved their combat effectiveness while making them increasingly inhuman in appearance and behavior. The systematic destruction of loyalist forces throughout the Ultramar sector created a cascade effect that extended far beyond the immediate military situation to encompass fundamental changes in the region's political and spiritual landscape. Worlds that had been bastions of imperial loyalty for centuries found themselves cut off from reinforcement and facing enemies whose capabilities transcended normal military parameters. The psychological impact of the traitors' success encouraged defection and collaboration among populations that had previously been unshakably loyal to imperial rule. The Shadow Crusade's theological objectives began achieving measurable success as converted populations on conquered worlds started spreading chaos doctrine to neighboring systems through trade networks and communication channels that the traitors had deliberately left intact. This organic expansion of chaos influence created a self-sustaining corruption that would continue long after the military phase of the campaign had concluded, fulfilling Lorgar's vision of permanent transformation rather than mere conquest. The culmination of the Shadow Crusade's ritual preparations reached its crescendo as the combined fleets of the Word-Bearers and World Eaters approached Nuceria, the world that had shaped Angron's tormented existence and would now witness his final transformation. The return to his homeworld was not merely symbolic, but essential to the complex demonic ritual that Lorgar had been orchestrating throughout their campaign of destruction. The psychic resonance between Angron and the planet where he had suffered so greatly would provide the spiritual anchor necessary to complete his apotheosis, while the accumulated blood debt from their conquests across Ultramar had satisfied Khorne's requirements for such a momentous elevation. The Nucerian high riders who had once tormented the young Primarch in their gladiatorial pits now cowered in their fortified cities as orbital bombardment rained down upon their world. The irony was not lost on Angron, though his capacity for such complex emotional recognition had been severely compromised by decades of neurological deterioration and increasing demonic influence. The butcher's nails that had been forced into his skull by these same oppressors now sang with anticipation as Khorne's presence grew stronger in the material realm, the artificial pain that had plagued him for so long beginning to transform into something approaching divine ecstasy. Lorgar's preparations for the ritual had been meticulous, drawing upon millennia of accumulated knowledge about the precise requirements for elevating a mortal being to demonhood. The Word-Bearer's Primarch understood that Angron's existing neurological damage would actually facilitate the process, as the butcher's nails had already begun breaking down the barriers between his consciousness and the warp. The constant artificial stimulation had created neural pathways that were perfectly aligned with Khorne's domain, making the 12th Primarch an ideal candidate for transformation into one of the Blood God's greatest champions. The ritual site chosen for Angron's apotheosis was the very mountain range where his gestation pod had crashed decades earlier, the location where his torment had begun and where it would now reach its ultimate purpose. Word-Bearer's sorcerers had spent weeks preparing the area, carving massive ritual circles into the living rock and inscribing them with symbols that hurt to look upon with unaugmented eyes. The geometric patterns drew their power from the accumulated suffering that had occurred on Nuceria over the centuries, channeling the psychic resonance of countless gladiatorial deaths into a focused conduit for demonic manifestation. The blood required for such a momentous ritual could not come from ordinary sources, but demanded the life essence of beings whose deaths would resonate across both the material realm and the warp. Lorgar had carefully orchestrated the Shadow Crusade to provide exactly such sacrifices, with the skulls and blood of loyalist space marines, planetary governors, and countless civilians creating a psychic maelstrom that drew Khorne's attention like a beacon. The ritual circles carved into Nuceria's mountains ran red with this accumulated offering, the liquid seeming to move with its own volition as demonic forces began to stir in response. Angron's physical condition had deteriorated dramatically during the final approach to Nuceria, his body racked by spasms as the butcher's nails responded to the growing psychic pressure. The neural implants that had tormented him for so long were beginning to resonate with frequencies that existed beyond normal reality, their crude archaeotech components somehow interfacing with cosmic forces that their creators could never have imagined. His twin chain axes, Gorefather and Gorechild, had begun manifesting supernatural properties that made them glow with internal heat and hunger for violence that transcended their mechanical function. The World Eaters who witnessed their Primarch's transformation during these final days reported experiences that challenged their understanding of reality itself. Angron's presence had become physically oppressive, creating an aura of barely contained violence that made even his most corrupted gene sons uncomfortable in his vicinity. The artificial aggression generated by their own neural implants paled in comparison to the raw fury that radiated from their Primarch, while his physical form seemed to fluctuate between its normal dimensions and something far more terrible that existed partially in the warp. Captain Khorne found himself serving as the primary intermediary between Angron and the ritual preparations, his own corruption having progressed to the point where he could withstand direct exposure to his Primarch's transformed presence. The butcher's nails implanted in his skull had begun manifesting properties that suggested demonic enhancement, allowing him to perceive aspects of the ritual that remained invisible to unaugmented senses. His coordination of World Eater's forces during the final preparations demonstrated tactical capabilities that clearly exceeded his previous limitations, suggesting that Khorne's influence was already beginning to reward his faithful service. The actual ritual began at the moment when Nuceria's primary star reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the mountain peaks where Angron's suffering had first begun. Lorgar stood at the center of the massive ritual circle, his voice raised in invocations that seemed to make the air itself bleed, as he called upon powers that existed beyond mortal comprehension. The word-bearer sorcerers who surrounded the ritual site added their own voices to the chant, creating harmonic frequencies that opened rifts between the material realm and the warp through which demonic entities began to manifest. The sacrificial component of the ritual required the deaths of specific individuals whose life essence would provide the final catalyst for Angron's transformation. Lorgar had preserved several captured Ultramarines officers for exactly this purpose, their gene seed heritage and unwavering loyalty to the Emperor making their deaths particularly resonant within Khorne's domain. These Space Marines were bound within the ritual circle, their power armor stripped away to expose the flesh that would soon feed the growing supernatural maelstrom. Angron's participation in these sacrificial killings marked the final abandonment of any vestige of his original personality that might have survived the decades of neurological torment. The Primarch moved among the bound prisoners with mechanical precision, his chain axes carving through enhanced physiology with supernatural ease, while his face remained completely expressionless. The artificial pain generated by the butcher's nails had been replaced by something approaching divine bliss, as each death fed the growing ritual energy and brought him closer to his ultimate transformation. The blood that flowed from these ritual killings did not behave according to normal physical laws, but instead moved with purposeful direction towards specific points within the carved symbols that covered the mountain's surface. The liquid seemed to glow with internal light as it filled the geometric patterns, creating a network of interconnected channels that pulsed with energy drawn from both the material realm and the warp. The sight of this supernatural phenomenon broke the minds of several World Eaters who had not yet achieved sufficient corruption to witness such manifestations without psychological damage. The moment of actual transformation began with a sound that existed beyond normal auditory perception, a resonance that seemed to emerge from the fundamental structure of reality itself as the barriers between dimensions began to collapse. Angron's physical form became the focal point for energies that defied comprehension, his flesh simultaneously burning away and being reborn as something far more terrible and magnificent. The butcher's nails that had tormented him for so long were consumed in this process, their crude archaeotech components proving inadequate containers for the divine fury that now filled his being. The Primarch's body expanded beyond its original dimensions as demonic essence merged with his enhanced physiology, creating a form that combined the worst aspects of both mortal and supernatural existence. His skin became the color of dried blood, stretched tight over muscles that rippled with power that transcended normal biological limitations. Massive brass wings erupted from his shoulders, their metallic surfaces inscribed with symbols that hurt to perceive directly while radiating heat that made the surrounding air shimmer with thermal distortion. Angron's face underwent the most dramatic transformation, his features reshaping themselves into something that retained hints of his original appearance while incorporating elements that belonged purely to Khorne's domain. His eyes became pools of molten brass that glowed with internal fire, while his teeth elongated into fangs capable of tearing through ceramite as easily as flesh. The neural implant scars that had marked his skull for decades were replaced by brass fixtures that seemed to grow directly from his transformed bone structure, creating a crown of metal that pulsed with the rhythm of his supernatural heartbeat. The newly ascended Daemon Primarch's first act was to release a roar that shattered the mountain peaks surrounding the ritual site and sent shockwaves across Nuceria's surface that could be felt on the planet's far side. The sound carried within it all the rage and pain that had accumulated during his mortal existence, amplified by demonic power, until it became a weapon capable of killing unprotected humans through pure acoustic force. The World Eaters who witnessed this moment of birth felt their own neural implants respond to their Primarch's transformed presence, creating feedback loops of artificial aggression that drove many of them into states of berserker fury. The physical laws that governed normal reality seemed to bend around Angron's transformed presence as his demonic nature asserted itself in the material realm. The air around him shimmered with heat distortion, while the ground beneath his feet began to crack and bleed as if wounded by his very existence. His twin chain axes had been transformed along with their wielder, becoming demonic weapons that hungered for violence, with an intelligence that bordered on sentience, while their chains moved with supernatural speed that created afterimages in the air. Lorger's satisfaction at the successful completion of the ritual was evident despite the careful control he maintained over his emotional responses. The Word-Bearer's Primarch had invested years of planning and countless resources in achieving this moment, and Angron's transformation represented validation of his theological understanding and his mastery of chaos doctrine. The newly ascended Daemon Primarch would serve as both weapon and symbol in the continuing war against the Emperor, demonstrating the power that awaited those who fully embraced the ruinous powers. The World Eaters who witnessed their Primarch's apotheosis found themselves changed by the experience in ways that went beyond mere psychological impact. The psychic resonance generated by such a momentous demonic manifestation created permanent alterations in their neural chemistry that enhanced their existing corruption, while opening new pathways for supernatural influence. Many reported visions of brass citadels and rivers of blood that suggested direct contact with Khorne's domain, while others experienced physical mutations that improved their combat effectiveness at the cost of their remaining humanity. The immediate aftermath of the transformation saw Angron testing his enhanced capabilities against the Nucerian forces that had dared to resist the traitor landing. The Daemon Primarch moved across the battlefield with speed that made tracking his position nearly impossible, his brass wings allowing him to transition seamlessly between ground and aerial combat, while his transformed weapons carved through defensive positions with supernatural efficiency. The High Riders who had once tormented him in their gladiatorial pits found themselves facing retribution that exceeded their worst nightmares, as their former slave had returned as something approaching a god of war. The systematic destruction of Nuceria's remaining population centers served both as celebration of Angron's ascension and as final offering to Khorne for the successful completion of the ritual. The World Eaters who participated in these operations fought with enhanced ferocity that reflected their Primarch's transformed nature, their own neural implants resonating with his demonic presence in ways that amplified their artificial aggression beyond previous limits. The planet that had shaped Angron's tormented existence was transformed into a monument to violence that would serve as a permanent gateway between the material realm and Khorne's domain. The few surviving Nucerian High Riders who witnessed Angron's return as a Daemon Primarch experienced psychological trauma that transcended normal human comprehension. Their understanding of reality collapsed as they confronted the transformed being who had once been their property, his ascension to demonhood representing the complete inversion of the natural order they had taken for granted. The terror they experienced in their final moments provided additional psychic energy that fed Khorne's growing influence in the material realm, while serving as fitting conclusion to the injustices they had inflicted during their lives of privilege and cruelty. The transformation of Angron into a Daemon Primarch represented more than just the ascension of a single being to demonhood. It marked the emergence of Khorne's most potent weapon in the material realm, one that would soon be unleashed upon the very heart of the Imperium. As the War Master's forces prepared for their final assault on Terra, Angron's presence among the traitor legions created a psychological weapon that extended far beyond his already formidable combat capabilities. The sight of a transformed Primarch leading Chaos forces would test the faith of even the most dedicated Imperial defenders, while demonstrating the terrible price of defying the ruinous powers. The journey to Terra saw the World Eaters' Legion undergo further transformation as their proximity to their ascended Primarch accelerated their own corruption. The demonic aura that surrounded Angron created a field of supernatural influence that enhanced the effects of their neural implants while opening new pathways for chaos corruption. Space Marines who had previously maintained some vestige of their original personalities found themselves consumed by artificial rage that made coherent thought increasingly difficult. The artificial pain generated by the butcher's nails was gradually replaced by a burning hunger for violence that could only be satisfied through acts of extreme brutality. Captain Khorne's evolution during this period demonstrated the ultimate fusion of neural enhancement with demonic blessing, as his tactical capabilities somehow improved despite the obvious deterioration of his cognitive functions. His coordination of World Eater's assault forces had become an art form that transcended normal military doctrine, relying on intuitive understanding of violence rather than rational planning. The brass collar that had appeared around his neck during Angron's transformation pulsed with the same rhythm as his Primarch's supernatural heartbeat, creating a sympathetic resonance that allowed him to channel Khorne's favor directly into combat effectiveness. The World Eater's approach to the solar system created immediate complications for Imperial defense planners who had been preparing for conventional siege warfare rather than supernatural assault. Their fleet movements displayed tactical patterns that defied logical analysis, with vessels appearing to coordinate through means that transcended normal communication protocols. The presence of a Daemon Primarch aboard their flagship created warp disturbances that interfered with Imperial augury, while generating psychological effects that could be felt across entire star systems. Imperial forces manning the outer system's defensive installations reported disturbing phenomena as the World Eater's fleet approached their positions. Astropathic communications became increasingly unreliable as Angron's presence created interference patterns in the warp that scrambled psychic messages and drove sensitive individuals to madness. Void shields flickered without apparent cause, while machine spirits in critical systems began displaying erratic behavior that suggested supernatural influence. The very presence of an ascended demon in the material realm was beginning to warp reality around it in ways that Imperial technology was not designed to handle. The assault on Luna's defensive networks provided the first demonstration of Angron's enhanced capabilities against prepared Imperial positions. The Daemon Primarch's approach to the moon's surface created atmospheric disturbances that registered on seismic equipment as earthquakes, while his presence generated electromagnetic anomalies that disabled entire communication arrays. The solar auxilia forces manning Luna's gun batteries found themselves facing an enemy whose very existence challenged their understanding of what was possible within the laws of physics. Angron's assault on the lunar fortifications displayed combat capabilities that transcended even his previous extremes of violence and destruction. His demonic form moved across the battlefield with speed that made visual tracking nearly impossible, while his brass wings allowed him to transition seamlessly between ground assault and aerial bombardment of defensive positions. The transformed chain axes, Gorefather and Gorechild, carved through reinforced barriers as easily as flesh, their demonic intelligence allowing them to seek out structural weaknesses that conventional weapons would have missed. The psychological impact of witnessing a Daemon Primarch in combat proved as devastating as his physical assault capabilities. Solar Auxilia troops who had trained for decades to face the worst enemies humanity could imagine found themselves confronting something that existed beyond their comprehension. The sight of Angron's transformed features and the sound of his supernatural roar broke the morale of entire regiments, causing mass desertion among forces that had previously been considered unshakably loyal to Imperial rule. The World Eaters who followed their ascended Primarch into battle on Luna demonstrated enhanced combat effectiveness that clearly indicated supernatural influence beyond their neural implants. Individual Space Marines displayed strength and endurance that exceeded normal Astartes' capabilities by significant margins, while their complete indifference to injuries that should have been incapacitating suggested demonic enhancement of their already formidable physiology. The brass fixtures that had begun appearing on their armor pulsed with the same rhythm as Angron's heartbeat, creating visual confirmation of their supernatural connection to their transformed Gene Father. The fall of Luna's primary command bunker occurred when Angron personally breached its reinforced blast doors through the application of raw physical force that should have been impossible even for a Primarch. The Daemon Primarch's assault on the facility's defenders created carnage that exceeded even the World Eater's previous standards for brutality, with Imperial personnel reduced to component parts by weapons that moved too quickly for human perception to follow. The systematic slaughter of Luna's command staff eliminated Imperial coordination for the Moon's remaining defensive positions, while providing additional blood sacrifice to feed Khorne's growing influence in the solar system. The capture of Luna's orbital defense platforms provided the traitor forces with strategic advantages that extended far beyond mere military considerations. The World Eater's occupation of these installations created permanent breaches in reality that allowed lesser demons to manifest without the complex rituals normally required for such summoning. These supernatural entities served as force multipliers that enhanced the traitor's combat effectiveness, while creating additional psychological pressure on Imperial defenders who found themselves facing enemies that existed beyond normal physical laws. The approach to Terra itself saw Angron's influence reach unprecedented levels as the Daemon Primarch drew closer to the world where his gene father ruled from the Golden Throne. The psychic resonance between the ascended demon and the Emperor created interference patterns that affected astropathic communication across the entire solar system, while generating warp storms that made conventional space travel increasingly dangerous. Imperial forces found themselves isolated from higher command as their communication networks failed under the strain of supernatural interference. The World Eater's participation in the initial bombardment of Terra's orbital defenses demonstrated their complete transformation from disciplined space marines to demonic berserkers, whose primary motivation was the satisfaction of their artificial bloodlust. Their assault craft approached Imperial defensive positions without regard for tactical coordination or casualty minimization, relying instead on overwhelming violence and supernatural enhancement to achieve their objectives. The sight of World Eater's vessels ramming Imperial defense platforms rather than engaging in conventional combat created additional psychological pressure on Loyalist forces. The breaching of Terra's outer defensive perimeter occurred when Angron personally led World Eater's assault forces against the Eternity Wall spaceport, his demonic presence creating a focal point for chaos influence that allowed lesser demons to manifest directly on the planet's surface. The Daemon Primarch's assault on the spaceport's defensive positions created immediate tactical advantages for traitor forces, while demonstrating the futility of conventional fortifications against supernatural enemies. Imperial Guard regiments that had been positioned to repel conventional assault found themselves facing enemies whose capabilities transcended normal military parameters. The systematic destruction of Terra's defensive installations served multiple purposes within the broader framework of the siege, providing immediate tactical advantages while creating the suffering and chaos that fed all the ruinous powers. World Eater's assault teams carved paths of destruction through Imperial positions that left no survivors, their neural implants and demonic enhancement combining to create levels of violence that horrified even veteran Imperial forces. The brass fixtures that adorned their armor glowed with internal heat as they fed on the bloodshed, creating visual confirmation of their supernatural nature. Captain Khorne's performance during the assault on Terra's defenses established his reputation as one of Khorne's most favored champions, though his dedication to the Blood God remained largely unconscious. His tactical coordination of World Eater's forces during complex urban combat operations demonstrated capabilities that clearly exceeded his original limitations, while his personal combat effectiveness had reached levels that challenged even other Space Marine champions. The brass collar around his neck had begun manifesting additional properties that suggested direct demonic blessing, including the ability to deflect weapons fire through supernatural means. The World Eater's advance toward the Imperial Palace created a trail of destruction that could be seen from orbital positions, their assault leaving entire districts of the capital city burning, while the bodies of Imperial defenders lined the streets. The artificial aggression generated by their neural implants found perfect satisfaction in the systematic slaughter of Terra's population, while their demonic enhancement allowed them to continue fighting despite injuries that should have proven fatal. The sight of Space Marines continuing to advance while missing limbs or suffering grievous wounds broke the morale of Imperial forces who had expected to face disciplined opponents. The assault on the Imperial Palace's outer defenses provided Angron with his first opportunity to test his enhanced capabilities against the fortifications that protected the Emperor himself. The Daemon Primarch's approach to the palace walls created immediate structural damage as his presence warped reality around him, causing ancient stonework to crack and bleed as if wounded by his very existence. The defensive systems that had protected the palace for millennia began failing as machine spirits corrupted by his demonic aura turned against their imperial masters. The breakthrough at the Ultimate Gate occurred when Angron personally led a World Eater's assault against the massive portal that guarded the palace's inner sanctum. The Daemon Primarch's assault on the gate's defenders created carnage that exceeded even his previous displays of violence, with Imperial fists and custodian guard falling before weapons that moved with supernatural speed and precision. The sight of the Emperor's most elite defenders being systematically slaughtered by a transformed Primarch created psychological effects that rippled throughout the palace's remaining garrison. The World Eaters who followed Angron through the breached Ultimate Gate found themselves fighting in corridors that had witnessed 10,000 years of Imperial history, their presence desecrating sacred spaces that had been untouched by enemy forces since the palace's construction. The artificial aggression generated by their neural implants reached new heights as they drew closer to the Emperor's throne room, while their demonic enhancement allowed them to perceive aspects of the palace's psychic defenses that remained invisible to normal senses. The final approach to the throne room saw Angron's corruption reach its ultimate expression as the Daemon Primarch prepared to confront the being who had claimed to be his father. The artificial pain that had plagued him since his discovery on Nuceria had been completely replaced by divine ecstasy as Khorne's favor flowed through him, while his transformed weapons hungered for the ultimate prize that awaited beyond the throne room's massive doors. The World Eaters who accompanied him into this final battle carried with them the accumulated rage of decades spent in service to a system that had never valued their sacrifice. The news of Horus's defeat aboard his flagship reached the World Eaters as they prepared for their final assault on the throne room, creating immediate confusion among forces that had been focused entirely on their immediate objective. The War Master's death eliminated the coordinating intelligence that had held the traitor alliance together, while removing the strategic vision that had made their rebellion possible. Without Horus's leadership, the individual traitor legions found themselves isolated and vulnerable to Imperial counterattack. Angron's response to the War Master's defeat demonstrated the complete dominance of his demonic nature over any vestige of rational strategic thinking that might have survived his transformation. Rather than recognizing the changed tactical situation and adapting accordingly, the Daemon Primarch's only concern was the immediate satisfaction of his supernatural bloodlust through continued violence against Imperial forces. His neural implants and demonic blessing had created a feedback loop that made retreat or negotiation psychologically impossible, trapping him in a cycle of violence that could only end in death or victory. The World Eaters' withdrawal from Terra occurred under circumstances that reflected their complete transformation from disciplined Space Marines to chaos-corrupted berserkers whose primary loyalty was to violence itself rather than any strategic objective. Their retreat from the Imperial Palace was conducted without coordination or planning, with individual units fighting rearguard actions that served no purpose beyond satisfying their artificial bloodlust. The sight of World Eaters continuing to engage Imperial forces, even as their overall position became untenable, demonstrated their complete abandonment of rational military doctrine. The fighting retreat through Terra's burning streets provided the World Eaters with additional opportunities to indulge their enhanced aggression against Imperial forces who were attempting to capitalize on the traitors' disorganization. Individual Space Marines fought with supernatural ferocity that made conventional pursuit tactics ineffective, while their complete indifference to casualties allowed them to inflict disproportionate losses on Imperial forces even during their withdrawal. The brass fixtures on their armor continued to glow with internal heat as they fed on the violence, creating visual confirmation of their demonic nature. The evacuation to the Eye of Terror represented the World Eater's final abandonment of the material realm as their primary area of operations, though their transformation had made such considerations largely irrelevant to their continued existence. Angron's demonic nature allowed him to exist indefinitely in either realm, while his gene sons had become so corrupted that the distinction between reality and the warp had lost much of its meaning. Their withdrawal from Terra was not a retreat, but a transition to a different phase of their eternal war against everything that represented order and civilization. The establishment of demon worlds within the Eye of Terror provided the World Eaters with operational bases that reflected their transformed nature and their complete dedication to Khorne's worship. These planets existed in a state of perpetual warfare, where the laws of physics bent to accommodate supernatural violence, creating environments where the Legion's enhanced aggression could find constant satisfaction. The cities that rose on these worlds were built from brass and bone, their architecture designed to channel the psychic energy generated by endless combat toward the glory of the Blood God. Angron's role as Lord of these demon worlds demonstrated his complete integration with Khorne's domain and his function as the Blood God's primary champion in both material and supernatural conflicts. The Daemon Primarch's presence transformed entire planets into extensions of his patron deity's realm, creating permanent breaches between dimensions that allowed unlimited demonic manifestation. His palace fortress became a focal point for chaos influence that could be felt across multiple star systems, serving as both military headquarters and religious shrine for the worship of violence itself. The World Eaters who served under their ascended Primarch on these demon worlds found their own corruption accelerated by constant exposure to concentrated chaos influence and the supernatural environment that surrounded them. Their neural implants evolved into organic components of their transformed physiology, while their power armor fused with their enhanced flesh to create hybrid entities that existed somewhere between Space Marine and Demon. The artificial aggression that had once tormented them became a source of divine ecstasy that made their previous existence seem like a pale shadow of true experience. The long war that followed the Heresy's conclusion saw the World Eaters emerge from the Eye of Terror in raids and invasions that brought their enhanced violence to Imperial worlds across the galaxy. These operations served multiple purposes within Khorne's broader strategy, providing blood sacrifice to feed the Blood God's power, while demonstrating the futility of Imperial resistance to chaos influence. Angron's personal participation in these campaigns created psychological weapons that extended far beyond his immediate combat capabilities, as news of the Daemon Primarch's presence could break Imperial morale before battle was even joined. The World Eaters' approach to warfare during the Long War reflected their complete transformation from disciplined military force to supernatural weapon of pure destruction. Their raids on Imperial worlds followed no strategic pattern beyond the immediate satisfaction of their bloodlust, with target selection based on the potential for maximum violence rather than tactical advantage. The sight of World Eaters' forces emerging from warp rifts to assault civilian populations created terror that spread far beyond their immediate operational area, serving Khorne's objectives even when no military goals were achieved. The transformation of Angron into a Daemon Primarch fundamentally altered his relationship with reality itself, binding his existence to the warp in ways that transcended the limitations of mortal flesh, while creating new forms of imprisonment that would define his eternal existence. Unlike his gene sons, who remained primarily creatures of the material realm despite their corruption, Angron's ascension made him a true extension of Khorne's will, capable of manifesting in real space only when specific conditions aligned to support his demonic nature. The brass collar that had appeared during his transformation served as both symbol of his elevation and anchor that connected him to the Blood God's domain, pulsing with energies that existed beyond normal comprehension. The mechanics of Angron's manifestation in the material realm required constant feeding through acts of violence and bloodshed, creating a symbiotic relationship between his presence and the warfare that surrounded him. Extended periods in real space without sufficient carnage would gradually weaken his physical form until he was forced to retreat to the warp, while massive battles and widespread slaughter could sustain his manifestation for months or even years at a time. This dependency on violence created tactical limitations that affected World Eater's operations, as their Primarch's availability for direct leadership was tied to the intensity of whatever conflict they were engaging in. The demonic legions that answered to Angron's command represented some of Khorne's most favored servants, drawn from the ranks of mortal champions who had earned the blood god's attention through exceptional displays of martial prowess and dedication to violence. Bloodthirsters, the greater demons of Khorne, served as his primary lieutenants in campaigns that required coordination between multiple demon hosts, their own supernatural intelligence and combat capabilities, making them suitable commanders for operations that exceeded the tactical limitations of corrupted space marines. These towering entities stood 4 times the height of a mortal man, their brass-bound flesh radiating heat that could melt steel, while their massive axes carved through reality itself with each swing. The lesser demons that comprised the bulk of Angron's supernatural forces included bloodletters whose crimson skin wept constantly with the essence of violence, their hellblades capable of cutting through any material substance, while their presence on battlefields created zones of supernatural fury that affected both friend and foe. Fleshhounds served as his hunting packs, their enhanced senses allowing them to track prey across multiple dimensions, while their brass collars provided protection against psychic attacks that might otherwise banish them back to the warp. These creatures existed in a state of constant hunger for violence that made them ideal instruments for the Daemon Primarch's will. The coordination between Angron's demonic legions and his remaining World Eaters' forces created tactical capabilities that transcended normal military doctrine, with supernatural entities serving as force multipliers that enhanced the Space Marines' already formidable combat effectiveness. Bloodthirsters could appear at critical moments to break enemy resistance, while bloodletter packs provided overwhelming numbers that could swamp defensive positions through sheer volume of attacks. The psychological impact of facing both corrupted Space Marines and literal demons simultaneously proved devastating to Imperial forces who found their training inadequate for such supernatural opposition. The first major incursion following the heresy occurred during the War of the Beast in the 32nd millennium, when Angron manifested on the Forge world Lucius to lead a massive assault against the Adeptus Mechanicus installations there. His approach to the planet created immediate disruption of the tech priest's sacred machinery, with machine spirits throughout the Forge complexes becoming corrupted by his demonic presence. The Daemon Primarch's assault on the primary manufactorum created a cascade of explosions that could be seen from orbital positions, while his World Eaters carved through Skitarii defenders with enhanced ferocity that reflected their proximity to their ascended Gene Father. The Siege of Lucius demonstrated Angron's ability to coordinate complex military operations despite his obvious psychological limitations, with bloodthirster commanders executing tactical maneuvers that suggested direct communication with their Daemon Primarch overlord. The systematic destruction of the Forge world's production capabilities served multiple purposes within Khorne's broader strategy, eliminating Imperial military assets while creating the suffering and chaos that fed all the ruinous powers. The brass foundries that the World Eaters established among the ruins continued producing demonic weapons long after the campaign's conclusion, creating permanent corruption that would influence the sector for millennia. The 34th millennium witnessed Angron's manifestation during the Dominion of Fire, where his presence transformed a routine compliance action into a sector-wide conflagration that consumed dozens of Imperial worlds. His coordination of World Eaters' warbands with native chaos cults created a rebellion that required 3 full Space Marine chapters to suppress, demonstrating the force multiplier effect that a Daemon Primarch could provide to otherwise limited Chaos forces. The campaign's duration allowed Angron to maintain physical manifestation for nearly 2 decades, his form growing more terrible and powerful as the violence escalated across multiple star systems. The psychological warfare aspects of Angron's campaigns proved as devastating as his direct combat capabilities, with news of the Daemon Primarch's presence creating panic that spread far beyond his immediate operational area. Imperial Guard regiments reported mass desertion when faced with the prospect of engaging World Eater's forces led by their transformed Gene Father, while planetary governors sometimes surrendered entire worlds rather than risk the systematic slaughter that Angron's presence inevitably brought. These psychological victories allowed relatively small Chaos forces to achieve strategic objectives that would have required massive military investments under normal circumstances. The relationship between Angron and the other Chaos powers remained complex and often antagonistic, as Khorne's domain of straightforward violence conflicted with the more subtle approaches favored by Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh. The Daemon Primarch's single-minded focus on immediate bloodshed made him unsuitable for operations that required political manipulation or long-term planning, while his contempt for weakness extended to Chaos forces that relied on corruption or seduction rather than direct confrontation. This philosophical inflexibility limited his effectiveness in campaigns that required coordination with servants of other ruinous powers. The competition between Khorne's champions for their patron deities' favor created additional complications in Angron's relationships with other powerful demons and Chaos lords. Demon princes who had achieved their elevation through different paths sometimes challenged his authority, leading to internal conflicts that could derail entire campaigns as supernatural entities settled personal disputes through combat. The Daemon Primarch's response to such challenges was invariably violent and immediate, his twin chainaxes settling questions of precedence through demonstrations of superior combat capability that left no room for future disagreement. Angron's position within Khorne's hierarchy was secured not through political maneuvering, but through his consistent ability to generate the massive bloodshed that the Blood God required for maintaining power within the warp. His campaigns across Imperial space created cascading effects that fed Khorne's domain with the psychic energy generated by warfare, while his personal combat record included victories over enemy champions that resonated throughout both material and supernatural realms. The skulls that adorned his fortress palace represented not mere trophies but spiritual currency that maintained his standing among Khorne's greatest servants. The 36th millennium brought Angron's most sustained manifestation during the Gothic War, where his coordination of World Eater's forces with the Blackstone fortresses created unprecedented opportunities for large-scale destruction. His presence aboard these ancient weapons transformed them into something approaching demon engines, their reality-warping capabilities enhanced by his supernatural nature, while their crews were gradually corrupted by exposure to his demonic aura. The systematic destruction of Imperial Navy assets during this campaign created a power vacuum that allowed Chaos forces to establish permanent footholds throughout the Gothic sector. The tactical evolution of World Eater's forces under Angron's direct leadership demonstrated the enhancement that demonic influence could provide to already formidable Space Marine capabilities. Individual Chaos Marines displayed strength and endurance that clearly exceeded normal Astartes parameters, while their coordination during complex operations suggested supernatural communication methods that transcended normal command structures. The brass fixtures that adorned their armor served as conduits for their Primarch's influence, creating sympathetic resonance that allowed him to coordinate their actions across vast distances. The establishment of demon worlds within the Eye of Terror provided Angron with permanent bases of operation that reflected his transformed nature and his complete dedication to Khorne's worship. These planets existed in states of perpetual warfare, where the laws of physics bent to accommodate supernatural violence, creating environments where his enhanced aggression could find constant satisfaction. The cities that rose on these worlds were built from brass and bone, their architecture designed to channel the psychic energy generated by endless combat toward the glory of the blood god. The 37th millennium witnessed multiple manifestations as Angron led increasingly ambitious raids against imperial strongholds, his growing confidence in his demonic abilities allowing him to maintain physical presence for extended periods. The assault on Cadia's outer defenses during this period demonstrated his ability to coordinate massive supernatural forces against prepared imperial positions, with bloodthirster legions serving as shock troops while World Eater's warbands exploited the breaches they created. The campaign's ultimate failure resulted not from imperial resistance, but from internal conflicts between competing chaos factions that undermined the unified command structure necessary for such complex operations. The relationship between Angron and his surviving Gene sons evolved throughout the millennia, as both Primarch and Legion underwent continued transformation under Chaos influence. The World Eaters who served directly under their Daemon Primarch found their own corruption accelerated by constant exposure to his supernatural presence, their neural implants evolving into organic components of their transformed physiology, while their power armor fused with their enhanced flesh. These changes improved their combat effectiveness, while making them increasingly inhuman in appearance and behavior. The recruitment practices employed by World Eaters' warbands reflected their complete abandonment of traditional Space Marine selection criteria in favor of candidates whose psychological profiles suggested compatibility with neural implantation and chaos corruption. Aspirants were chosen based on their potential for violence and their tolerance for pain rather than their capacity for tactical thinking or strategic planning. The gene seed implantation process had been modified to include ritual components that honored Khorne, while ensuring that new Space Marines would be receptive to the supernatural influences that define the Legion's transformed nature. The 38th millennium brought Angron's participation in the 13th Black Crusade, where his coordination with Abaddon, the Despoiler, created unprecedented opportunities for chaos expansion into Imperial space. His assault on the Cadian Gate's defensive installations demonstrated the strategic value that a Daemon Primarch could provide to large-scale military operations, with his presence creating focal points for demonic manifestation that allowed supernatural forces to establish permanent beachheads in real space. The systematic destruction of Imperial Navy assets during the campaign eliminated the mobility advantages that Loyalist forces had traditionally relied upon to counter chaos incursions. The fall of Cadia itself provided Angron with his greatest manifestation opportunity in millennia, as the planet's destruction created psychic shockwaves that resonated throughout both material and supernatural realms. His presence during the Fortress World's final moments transformed what should have been a chaos victory into something approaching a religious experience for his followers, with World Eaters' forces fighting with supernatural ferocity that impressed even veteran chaos champions. The destruction of the pylons that had held back the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years created permanent changes in the galaxy's spiritual landscape that enhanced Angron's ability to manifest across multiple sectors simultaneously. The opening of the Great Rift fundamentally altered the strategic situation throughout the galaxy, creating conditions that favored Angron's demonic nature while providing unprecedented opportunities for large-scale manifestation. The warp storms that swept across Imperial space eliminated many of the barriers that had previously limited his physical presence, while the widespread warfare that followed created the constant bloodshed necessary to sustain his demonic form indefinitely. The Daemon Primarch's response to these changed circumstances demonstrated tactical adaptability that suggested his supernatural intelligence had evolved beyond the limitations imposed by his original neural damage. The Adeptus Crusade's attempts to restore Imperial control over chaos-corrupted sectors brought Loyalist forces into direct confrontation with Angron's enhanced capabilities, revealing the extent to which his demonic nature had evolved since the heresy. Primaris Space Marines equipped with the most advanced Imperial technology found themselves facing enemies whose supernatural enhancement rendered conventional tactical doctrine ineffective. The sight of World Eaters continuing to fight despite injuries, that should have proven instantly fatal, created psychological effects that extended far beyond immediate combat situations. The coordination between Angron's forces and other chaos entities during the era Indomitus demonstrated his growing influence within the broader framework of Khorne's domain. Demon princes and chaos lords who had previously operated independently began seeking alliance with the Daemon Primarch, recognizing that his reputation and combat record provided advantages that outweighed the complications of working with his volatile personality. These alliances created force multiplication effects that allowed relatively small chaos forces to achieve strategic objectives against numerically superior Imperial opposition. The establishment of permanent warp rifts throughout the galaxy provided Angron with unprecedented mobility and manifestation opportunities, allowing him to appear simultaneously in multiple sectors while maintaining sufficient physical presence to influence major military operations. His assault on the Vigilis system demonstrated these enhanced capabilities, with World Eater's forces appearing through dimensional breaches that bypassed Imperial defensive positions, while Bloodthirster legions materialized directly within Loyalist command centers. The systematic destruction of Imperial infrastructure during this campaign created cascading effects that influenced military operations across multiple sectors. The psychological impact of Angron's continued existence and growing power created strategic challenges for Imperial military planners, who struggled to develop effective countermeasures against an enemy whose capabilities transcended normal physical laws. The knowledge that a Daemon Primarch could manifest anywhere that sufficient violence occurred made defensive planning nearly impossible, while his reputation for overwhelming brutality discouraged resistance among Imperial forces who understood the futility of conventional tactics against supernatural opponents. The World Eater's evolution under their Daemon Primarch's influence continued throughout the 41st millennium, with individual warbands developing specialized capabilities that reflected their particular dedication to Khorne's various aspects. Some focused on the collection of skulls from worthy opponents, their armor decorated with brass fixtures that cataloged their victories while serving as conduits for demonic power. Others embraced the pursuit of perfect violence, their combat techniques refined through millennia of constant warfare, until they achieved levels of martial excellence that bordered on supernatural artistry. The relationship between Angron and the broader Chaos Pantheon remained defined by his single-minded dedication to Khorne's domain of straightforward violence, creating both opportunities and limitations for his strategic effectiveness. His contempt for the subtle approaches favored by other ruinous powers made him unsuitable for operations requiring political manipulation or long-term corruption, while his reputation for reliable brutality made him valuable in situations where immediate destruction was the primary objective. This specialization ensured his continued relevance within Chaos strategic planning, while limiting his ability to achieve truly decisive victories against Imperial forces. The shattering of Cadia and the birth of the Great Rift fundamentally transformed the strategic landscape of the 42nd millennium, creating conditions that allowed Angron's influence to spread far beyond his physical manifestations. The massive warp storms that now bisected the galaxy carried echoes of his demonic presence across countless worlds, while the widespread warfare that followed created the constant bloodshed necessary to sustain his power at unprecedented levels. World Eater's warbands emerged from the Eye of Terror and newly formed warp rifts with enhanced coordination and supernatural capabilities that reflected their Daemon Primarch's growing dominion over Khorne's domain. The fragmentation of the World Eater's legion into countless independent warbands following the heresy had initially seemed to diminish their strategic effectiveness, but the opening of the Great Rift revealed this dispersal as an inadvertent masterstroke of tactical positioning. Warbands that had spent millennia raiding isolated Imperial worlds suddenly found themselves connected through the warp storms that now dominated galactic geography, their scattered positions transformed into a network of chaos strongholds that could coordinate operations across vast distances. The brass collars and neural implants that marked veteran world eaters began resonating with frequencies that transcended normal communication methods, creating sympathetic connections that allowed widely separated forces to respond to their Daemon Primarch's will. Captain Khorne's emergence as the betrayer represented the ultimate fusion of neural enhancement with demonic blessing, his reputation for indiscriminate violence making him a focal point for world eaters who sought to emulate their Primarch's dedication to pure bloodshed. The brass collar that encircled his neck had evolved into a sophisticated relic that channeled Khorne's favor directly into combat effectiveness, while his chain axe Gorchuld had developed supernatural properties that made it hunger for violence, with an intelligence that bordered on sentience. His coordination of multiple World Eaters' warbands during the Dominion of Fire campaign demonstrated tactical capabilities that clearly exceeded his original limitations, suggesting that prolonged exposure to chaos influence had enhanced rather than degraded his strategic thinking. The gladiatorial combat traditions that Angron had brought from Nuceria became central organizing principles for World Eaters' culture throughout the Long War, with individual warbands establishing arena complexes on their demon worlds where space marines fought each other to unconsciousness or death. These contests served multiple purposes within the broader framework of Khorne worship, providing constant violence to satisfy the blood god's hunger, while creating hierarchies based purely on combat prowess rather than traditional military rank. The winners of these gladiatorial competitions earned the right to wear additional brass fixtures and receive enhanced neural implants that improved their effectiveness in actual combat operations. The influence of World Eaters' combat doctrine spread throughout the broader Chaos Space Marine community as other legions and renegade chapters adopted elements of their approach to warfare. The emphasis on close-quarters combat and overwhelming aggression proved particularly attractive to forces operating in the cramped confines of hive cities and space hulks, where ranged weapons were less effective than chain axes and combat knives. Imperial military analysts noted increasing reports of enemy space marines displaying the characteristic berserker fury and indifference to casualties that had once been unique to the 12th Legion, suggesting that World Eaters veterans were serving as training cadre for newly turned renegades. The ritual scarification and neural modification practices pioneered by the World Eaters became widespread among Chaos forces, seeking to enhance their combat effectiveness through artificial stimulation. Crude imitations of the Butcher's nails appeared in renegade Space Marine chapters across the galaxy, though these reproductions lacked the sophisticated integration with Primarch physiology that had made the original devices so effective. The surgical procedures required for implantation became ritualized activities that honored Khorne while creating bonds of shared suffering among the recipients, establishing brotherhood networks that transcended traditional Legion boundaries. Imperial military doctrine underwent significant revision in response to the enhanced threat posed by World Eaters forces and their imitators throughout the galaxy. The Tactica Imperialis was updated to include specific protocols for engaging enemies displaying artificial berserker fury, emphasizing the use of ranged weapons and defensive positions to exploit the tactical limitations created by neural enhancement. Imperial Guard training regimens began incorporating psychological preparation for facing enemies who showed no regard for their own survival, while Space Marine chapters developed specialized tactics for countering the overwhelming close-quarters assault that characterized World Eaters' operations. The theological implications of Angron's transformation created profound challenges for Imperial doctrine regarding the nature of the Primarchs and their intended purpose within the Emperor's grand design. The ecclesiarchy struggled to reconcile the existence of a Daemon Primarch with orthodox teaching about the Primarchs as perfect expressions of the Emperor's will, leading to doctrinal disputes that occasionally erupted into armed conflict between different factions within the Imperial Church. Some theologians argued that Angron's fall demonstrated the corrupting influence of chaos on even the most perfect of the Emperor's creations, while others suggested that his transformation revealed fundamental flaws in the Primarch project that called into question the Emperor's infallibility. The Imperial Creed's emphasis on the Emperor's divine nature became increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of evidence that one of his gene sons had achieved genuine demonhood through service to the ruinous powers. Missionary activities in sectors affected by World Eater's raids required careful theological preparation to address questions about how an allegedly perfect being could fall so completely to chaos corruption. The standard response that Angron's neural implants had compromised his judgment satisfied some believers, but created additional questions about why the Emperor had been unable or unwilling to remove the devices that caused his son's suffering. The Adeptus Mechanicus faced particular challenges in understanding Angron's transformation, as their scientific worldview struggled to accommodate the reality of a being who had transcended normal physical laws through supernatural means. Tech priests who studied captured World Eater's equipment reported technological anomalies that defied rational explanation, with weapons and armor displaying properties that suggested integration with forces that existed beyond normal reality. The brass fixtures that adorned veteran World Eater's equipment appeared to be composed of materials that did not exist in any known periodic table, while their neural implants had evolved into organic mechanical hybrids that challenged fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between flesh and machine. The philosophical implications of Angron's existence extended beyond theological considerations to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and free will. Imperial scholars debated whether the Daemon Primarch retained any vestige of his original personality or had been completely subsumed by Khorne's influence, with different conclusions leading to radically different assessments of moral responsibility for his actions. The possibility that neural modification could fundamentally alter personality raised disturbing questions about the nature of identity and the extent to which individuals could be held accountable for actions performed under artificial psychological influences. The study of captured World Eater's personnel provided Imperial medical authorities with unprecedented insights into the long-term effects of neural implantation and chaos corruption on space marine physiology. Apothecaries who examined deceased World Eaters discovered that their neural implants had evolved far beyond their original Nucerian specifications, developing organic components that integrated seamlessly with enhanced nervous systems while creating new neural pathways that appeared designed for supernatural communication. The brass collars worn by veteran World Eaters contained technological elements that defied Imperial understanding, suggesting either advanced archaeotech or genuine demonic influence in their construction. The psychological profiles of captured World Eaters revealed the complete breakdown of normal space marine conditioning and its replacement with artificial behavioral patterns that prioritized violence over all other considerations. Imperial interrogators found it nearly impossible to extract useful intelligence from prisoners whose neural implants made coherent conversation difficult, while their chaos corruption eliminated any loyalty to their former allegiances. The few World Eaters who retained sufficient cognitive function for interrogation displayed personality fragmentation that suggested multiple competing influences within their enhanced nervous systems. The impact of World Eaters' operations on Imperial military morale extended far beyond their immediate tactical effectiveness to encompass broader psychological effects that influenced recruitment and retention throughout the Imperial Guard. Regiments that had faced World Eaters' forces in combat reported significantly higher rates of desertion and psychological breakdown among survivors, while recruitment efforts in sectors affected by their raids struggled to find volunteers willing to risk confrontation with enemies who displayed supernatural capabilities. The knowledge that conventional weapons and tactics were largely ineffective against neurally enhanced berserkers created a sense of futility that undermined military discipline across multiple theaters of operation. The economic impact of World Eaters' raids on Imperial worlds created cascading effects that influenced strategic planning throughout entire sectors. Their preference for targeting population centers and industrial facilities maximized civilian casualties while minimizing the resources available for reconstruction, creating long-term economic damage that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Planetary governors in regions affected by World Eaters' activity began implementing defensive strategies that prioritized the protection of essential infrastructure over population centers, leading to social unrest and political instability that further weakened imperial control. The development of specialized anti-chaos tactics by imperial forces reflected growing understanding of the specific threats posed by neurally enhanced enemies and their demonic allies. Space Marine chapters began training dedicated assault companies equipped with flamers and meltaguns designed to exploit the close-range preferences of World Eaters' forces, while Imperial Guard regiments developed defensive doctrines that emphasized the creation of overlapping fields of fire to prevent berserker charges from reaching their lines. These tactical innovations achieved some success in reducing Imperial casualties, but could not address the fundamental advantage that supernatural enhancement provided to Chaos forces. The influence of Angron's gladiatorial traditions spread beyond military applications to affect civilian culture on worlds that had experienced World Eaters' occupation. Underground fighting pits appeared in hive cities across the galaxy, their organizers claiming inspiration from the combat traditions of the legendary Primarch, while their participants sought to emulate the fearlessness and aggression that characterized his followers. Imperial authorities struggled to suppress these activities while dealing with the broader social problems created by populations that had been exposed to chaos influence during enemy occupation. The technological legacy of the World Eaters' neural enhancement experiments influenced the development of Imperial military equipment and medical procedures throughout the 42nd millennium. While direct replication of the Butcher's nails remained beyond Imperial capabilities, research into their effects led to advances in pain management and combat stimulants that improved the effectiveness of conventional forces. The Adeptus Mechanicus developed servo skull variants equipped with brass components that provided enhanced battlefield coordination, though these devices required constant monitoring to prevent the kind of machine spirit corruption that had affected World Eaters' equipment. The strategic implications of Angron's continued existence as an active Daemon Primarch forced Imperial military planners to develop contingency plans for scenarios that had previously been considered impossible. The knowledge that a transformed Primarch could manifest anywhere that sufficient violence occurred made traditional defensive planning nearly obsolete, while his reputation for overwhelming brutality created psychological weapons that extended far beyond his immediate combat capabilities. Imperial forces found themselves fighting not just against physical enemies, but against the fear and despair that Angron's legend created among their own ranks. The World Eaters' role in the broader Chaos pantheon evolved throughout the millennia as their dedication to pure violence made them valuable assets for operations that required immediate destruction rather than subtle corruption. Their reliability in combat situations contrasted sharply with the unpredictability of other Chaos forces, making them preferred allies for demon princes and Chaos lords who needed to achieve specific tactical objectives without the complications that typically accompanied supernatural intervention. This specialization ensured their continued relevance within Chaos strategic planning, while limiting their ability to achieve truly decisive victories against Imperial forces that could adapt to their predictable tactics. The legacy of blood and rage that Angron bequeathed to the galaxy extends far beyond the immediate military threat posed by his World Eaters' Legion to encompass fundamental challenges to Imperial civilization and human understanding of consciousness itself. His transformation from a being created to unite humanity into a weapon of pure destruction represents the ultimate corruption of the Emperor's vision, while his continued existence serves as a constant reminder of the prices that ambition and power exact from those who pursue them without regard for moral consequences. The brass collar that binds him to Khorne's service stands as a symbol of how the pursuit of strength through violence ultimately leads only to enslavement, while the world eaters who follow him demonstrate the complete abandonment of everything that once made them human. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, Angron's legacy endures as both warning and weapon, his rage echoing across the stars as a testament to the terrible price of forsaking compassion for power and the eternal consequences of choosing violence over understanding in humanity's long struggle against the darkness that threatens to consume it.